Chapter 779. Thanks to the popularity of The City is Prosperous and the second season of America's Top Model, Lifetime took the opportunity to launch several other original series. Although the results couldn't compare to the two viewership leaders, it was enough to fill up the rest of Lifetime's viewership slots. It wasn't like last fall, when Project Runway and America's Top Model were left in the dust, while the rest of the viewership slots were still empty. As Lifetime began to discuss the new annual revenue-sharing contract with cable operators, other media groups that had been paying attention to Lifetime also began to study the reason for the rise of this television station. Yes, they were planning to follow the trend. This wasn't just happening in the film industry. Even Firefly and the other two companies were preparing to launch FFM, which was also planning to follow the trend of HBO. However, although the cable television industry was in the stage of a boom, Eric wasn't worried about these latecomers. After all, in this country where all industries were firmly controlled by capital, there weren't many people who would decisively invest without hesitation before the situation was clear. By the time they reacted, Lifetime would have already established its position in the industry. Similarly, in this country of capital, the first few months of every year were the time when major corporate giants handed in their report cards to investors, the media, and the public. Among the 7 big Hollywood companies, after last year's ocean strategy, coupled with the natural growth brought about by the strong recovery of the American economy, Time Warner's revenue for 1995 reached US $11 billion. However, among the 25 films released by Time Warner that year, except for Batman Forever, which earned US $330 million at the global box office with a US $100 million investment, and with the lucrative peripherals, which barely made a profit, the other big-budget films with a budget of more than US $50 million all ended poorly. In particular, Future Waterworld, which had a production cost of $175 million US, only grossed more than $80 million at the North American box office. Although the global box office reached $260 million US, Warner Pictures only managed to recoup more than $90 million US from the global box office share due to the generally low profits and high taxes in the overseas market. This project alone brought Time Warner a loss of more than $100 million US. Although Time Warner's Turner Broadcasting and HBO cable television businesses were highly profitable, they couldn't afford to lose money from the film business. In the end, the entire group's annual loss reached US $280 million, more than 3 times the previous year's. After the financial results were released, Time Warner was once again in turmoil. As the founder of Turner Broadcasting and a major shareholder of Time Warner, Ted Turner even proposed to break up Time Warner at the board meeting. Although the trend in recent years was to consolidate resources, this proposal still received the support of many board members. Viacom Group, which was firmly controlled by Sam Redstone, relied on the strong revenue performance of the blockbuster video rental chain. Its annual revenue exceeded US $10 billion, closely following Time Warner's annual revenue of US $107. However, compared to Time Warner's huge loss, Paramount achieved a net profit of $760 million US for the year. In terms of overall strength, News Corporation, whose business scope spanned the entire Western world, was comparable to Time Warner. However, News Corporation, whose business scope spanned the entire world, was too complicated in terms of its financial system and ownership structure. In some countries, their business was even settled separately. Therefore, 20th Century Fox, the subsidiary responsible for the film and television business in America, became the main representative of news worldwide. Because of this, 20th Century Fox's position was very similar to that of Seagram Group's control of Universal and Sony's control of Columbia. Coupled with the rapidly recovering performance of MGM, the subsequent 4 major companies had different profits and losses, and couldn't be compared to the previous 3 giants. In the first few months of the year, the American media successively listed the performance of the 6 Hollywood giants, but they still didn't get to see the most anticipated annual financial report of Firefly Group. Although the media were all scratching their heads in anticipation, after several low-key board meetings and discussions with the group's main creditors, the group of senior executives finally decided not to release Firefly Group's financial report. For non-listed companies, the release of financial report data had a very clear purpose. For example, last year, because of the issuance of US $8 billion worth of bonds, the integration of ABC Group had not been completely completed. Coupled with Ron Perlman's acquisition of Firefly's bonds, in order to prevent unnecessary speculation and worry in the capital market, Firefly Group released the financial data for the year. This year, everything within the group was on track. There were no internal or external problems, and there was no need to do such superfluous things to satisfy the curiosity of the capital market or the media. Of course, Eric didn't want to be too ostentatious, which was another important reason. After a few months of financial statistics, Firefly Group's annual revenue was finally fixed at US $23.9 billion, and realized operating net profit of US $2.57 billion. If the US $1.25 billion follow-up payment from the sale of ABC's assets and Disney's hand-drawn animation studio were included, Firefly's annual profit had reached US $3.82 billion. Not to mention, this figure was enough to arrogantly say to the remaining six giants, "Come at me together." In comparison, in 1995, Ford Motor, which had the highest profit among all the corporate giants in the United States, had an annual revenue of US $128.4 billion, and a net profit of only US $5.3 billion. Even if Firefly's non-operating profit of US $1.25 billion was excluded, the net profit of US $2.57 billion was enough to squeeze into the top 10 of the United States corporate profit list. The detailed annual financial data was only known to the board of directors and the core executives of Firefly Group. Even some of the important creditors only had a general understanding. With the professionalism of these people, of course, they would not disclose it to the media. Therefore, based on public data such as movie box office, TV program ratings, and other public data, although the relevant media and analysis organizations could predict that Firefly Group's annual profit would be terrifying, in the absence of any detailed data, they could only make their own assessments based on known information. Due to the lack of an official endorsement from the Firefly Group, even if these media figures were almost the same as the real figures, it was impossible to gain widespread recognition. When some of the public saw the terrifying annual profit figures of the Firefly Group in financial magazines, their first reaction was to question the accuracy of these figures. After all, if the annual profit figures of nearly $4 billion were true, then the profits of the Firefly Group alone would be enough to compete with the other big six. In the entire history of Hollywood, there had never been a case of a single person dividing 50% of Hollywood's profits. In the midst of the hubbub, the publication of Forbes magazine's 1996 World's Richest List once again caused an uproar in the media. After the release of Windows 95, Bill Gates, who owned 40% of Microsoft shares, relied on the Microsoft operating system to dominate the industry. His net worth skyrocketed from US $12.9 billion last year to US $18.5 billion. Behind him, Warren Buffett and the other three super-rich people also had assets that crossed the threshold of US $10 billion. However, at the top of this list, the eye-catching figure of US $67.7 billion was like the bright moon in the night sky, outshining the surrounding glimmering stars. Compared to US $46.5 billion last year, Eric's personal net worth had skyrocketed to US $21.2 billion in just 1 year, far surpassing everyone else on the list. At the same time the list was announced, Steve Forbes, the president of Forbes, personally wrote, "If Eric Williams bet all his assets on the Kuwait War 6 years ago, it could still be considered a reckless gamble." Over the years, Eric Williams has proven with facts that not only does he have amazing talent in film and television, but as a pure investor, he also has a keen vision that ordinary people can't reach. Starting from Yahoo in 1991, in the past 5 years, Eric Williams has invested nearly US $5 billion in the emerging internet, mobile communications, and other high-tech industries. Today, 5 years later, these investments have at least quadrupled and are worth more than US $20 billion. Of course, although Eric Williams' investments in the high-tech industry seem to be very successful, it is undeniable that the Firefly Group in Hollywood is the real foundation of Eric Williams. It is precisely because Firefly Group has brought in a steady stream of profits for Eric Williams that he was able to show his skills in the investment industry. Compared to publicly held companies such as Time Warner and Viacom, Firefly Group did not announce its annual financial data for 1995, but according to publicly available information, Firefly Group's annual turnover for 1995 should be around US $24 billion. This figure even exceeds the total annual revenue of Time Warner and Viacom. In terms of profits, Firefly Group's profitability is even more terrifying. Compared to Time Warner's annual loss of US $280 million and Viacom's annual net profit of US $760 million, Firefly Group's operating net profit for 1995 should be between US $2.3 billion and US $2.6 billion, which is 4 times that of Viacom and even close to the total profit of the 6 major film companies: Time Warner, Viacom, 20th Century Fox, Sony Pictures, Universal, and MGM. This kind of breathtaking profitability makes me feel that perhaps the federal IRS should really consider levying an alien immigration management tax on someone. Okay, this is a joke. The release of the new Forbes Rich list set off a frenzy of discussion in the media, but the most direct impact was on the day of the release of the latest issue of Forbes magazine. Because the magazine detailed Eric's investment and returns in the high-tech industry, the Nasdaq index was directly stimulated and rose by 5% that day. Many high-tech star stocks, including Cisco, AOL, and Microsoft, rose by more than 10%. The credibility of Forbes magazine was still very strong. Compared to other financial magazines' exaggerated or conservative profit estimates of Firefly Group, the data published by Forbes magazine was clearly more recognized. The fact that the global film market continued to explode and Hollywood's conquest of territories around the world was almost well known. But after seeing the terrifying profitability of Firefly Group, although there were negative examples of the losses of Warner Brothers and Sony Pictures, it still did not stop a large number of capital forces from once again flocking to Hollywood. Under such circumstances, on March 25, the 68th Academy Awards ceremony was held as scheduled at the Sacred Civic Auditorium in Los Angeles. Although Eric was invited as usual, he was absent again. It was not because he was too busy or anything else. The main reason was that sitting motionless at the Oscar ceremony for 3 hours was really not a pleasant thing. What's more, Firefly's films still only received some marginal nominations this year, so Eric had no need to attend. Eric did not want to go, and Drew, who had already begun to look for a dress, also declined the invitation. The two stayed in the girls' Beverly Hills mansion to watch the live broadcast together. The script for The Shawshank Redemption was still lying in the corner. There was no Oscar tragedy this year. In addition to the popular award winner Forrest Gump, several other nominated films such as Apollo 13 and Baby Pig did not show the popularity and influence of Forrest Gump. In the end, Forrest Gump successfully won 6 awards including Best Film and Best Director with 13 nominations. Tom Hanks also successfully won Best Actor for a second time, creating a new milestone in Oscar history. Although they did not attend the Oscar ceremony, they definitely had to have a celebration party. Because Forrest Gump was the only major nominated film this year, together with Firefly and MGM, there was really no need to hold a celebration party alone. In addition, as the former editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, Tina Brown, personally called to ask him to do so, Eric decided to hold the celebration party tonight at the Oscar party held by Vanity Fair. Tonight's Vanity Fair party was held at an art center at the foot of Beverly Hills, which was less than 5 kilometers away from Drew's mansion in Trousdale Manor. Eric and the girl were not in a hurry at all. They did not leave for the party until the live broadcast of the award ceremony was over. It was just past 9 o'clock in the evening in the Western Time. The car stopped in the parking lot outside the art center. As soon as Eric and Drew got out of the car, the reporters who were squatting outside swarmed over, and the dazzling magnesium lights flashed crazily. The opportunity to interview inside the Vanity Fair party was definitely not open to the public, but outside the party, the organizer could not control. Eric, do you think the number published by Forbes magazine is accurate? Mr. Williams, what do you think about Tom Hanks winning the Best Actor Oscar for a second time? Is there a public relations factor in this? Eric, how's the preparation for your new film going? Drew, do you and Eric plan to get married? When do you plan to have children? Eric and the girl just smiled at the camera. In a series of messy questions, several bodyguards and the organizer's security quickly surrounded them and escorted them into the party venue. Chapter 780. After coming to the photo wall and posing for a while, Eric and Drew walked along the long corridor to the party site under the guidance of the staff. Glancing at the people around them, the girl suddenly whispered in Eric's ear, "Eric, someone just asked us when we're going to have a baby." The people chatting by the glass windows in the corridor saw Eric and Selena and greeted them politely. Eric nodded in response and whispered in confusion, "Huh?" Drew suddenly seemed to be in high spirits. "What do you say? Let's have a baby?" Eric did not object. Although his biological age was not yet 26, his mental age had long passed the age where he would be resistant to children. Back in New York, Eric had even sensed that Cindy was trying to get pregnant with his child so that she could rise in status. After all, there were so many signs, and Linda was even involved in it. If he could not detect it, he would be stupid. Eric did not want to take the initiative to promote this matter, but he did not deliberately alienate Cindy. If they really had a child, it was not like he could not raise it. Although he had been reborn for a long time, he was still a somewhat traditional Asian at the end of the day. He had accumulated a large family business, so it was inevitable that he wanted to have more children. If he had more children, he would inherit the family business in the future. If he did not, he would obediently receive the trust. However, after listening to the girl's words, Eric asked, "Then, are you ready to be a mother? Taking care of a child is very troublesome." Drew tilted her head and said, "Natasha will help me. And, if it doesn't work, I can send him to New York and ask Joan to take care of him." Eric smiled and said, "Forget it. You don't even have a child yet, and you're already thinking of quitting. Wait until you're ready to be a mother." Although Drew had passed her 20th birthday last year and had started to manage MGM, one of the Big Seven, her playful mind had not changed much, perhaps because she wanted to compensate for her unbearable childhood. This was also the reason why Eric still felt that the girl beside him was still the baby-faced little girl after so many years. The lass was only acting on a whim. After hearing Eric's words, she quickly dismissed the idea. "Then let's wait a few years." When they walked into the party hall, the crew of Forrest Gump had already come to greet them. "Congratulations, everyone." Eric warmly hugged Robert Zemeckis, Tom Hanks, and the others. After that, he said to Hanks, "Tom, how does it feel to be the champion for a second consecutive time?" "Great, Eric, thank you." Hank's face was still brimming with an excited smile as he sincerely thanked Eric. He knew very well that if it weren't for Eric's special arrangements for 2 consecutive years, he wouldn't have been able to create such a miracle in Oscar history. Everyone chatted happily for a while, then walked to a round table in the hall and sat down to continue chatting. The nature of the Vanity Fair party was more of a dinner party. The guests who had just been excited for 3 hours at the award ceremony would definitely want to get a relatively quiet environment at this time. Soothing music, dim lights, and guests gathered in groups of 3 or 5 to feel this year's victory or loss, and to find opportunities to work harder next year. After talking about Forrest Gump, Drew casually asked Robert Zemeckis, "Robert, although it's a little early to ask, do you have any projects that you're interested in now?" "I'm looking forward to our next cooperation." Since his debut, Robert Zemeckis had been the kind of director who took the commercial route and was very innovative. Since his first comedy, Deception, in 1980, Robert Zemeckis' films had never failed in the commercial market. The well-known sci-fi series Back Again, and the animation and live-action Roger Rabbit he directed had achieved brilliant box office success. Therefore, at this time, it was not surprising that this girl wanted to take advantage of the great success of Forrest Gump to confirm her intention to cooperate with him. If they were not chatting, many people at the party might have come forward to try to win him over. In this case, when faced with similar problems, most people, even if they had no intention of continuing to cooperate, would very tactfully decline with a few perfunctory words. However, there was a brief hesitation in Robert Zemeckis' expression. He remembered that Steven Spielberg had talked to him in private not long ago, so he paused and said, "Of course, Drew, if there is a chance, we will definitely continue to cooperate." Drew noticed the change in Robert Zemeckis' expression, so he cleverly did not continue to talk about this matter and naturally changed the topic. While chatting, everyone felt a faint commotion at the entrance of the party, so they all turned their heads curiously. "Godfather is here," Drew, who was sitting on Eric's left side and had a convenient view, blurted out. Then he paused and said, And David Geffen and, well, Bill Gates, why are they together? Eric was not very interested at first, but when he heard the name Bill Gates, he turned his head curiously and happened to meet the eyes of the students at the door. They nodded at each other, then Bill Gates whispered something to Spielberg, who was next to him, and walked over with his wife, Melinda Gates. Eric vaguely realized something, but he did not feel too strange. Since the other party was walking over, Eric took the initiative to stand up and greet him with the girl. "Hey Bill, I didn't expect you to come." Eric politely shook hands with the student at the door, then gently hugged Melinda Gates, who was wearing a black dress, and complimented her, "Melinda, you're really beautiful tonight." "Thank you, Eric." Melinda Gates smiled politely, then said to Drew, who was next to Eric, "Drew is also very beautiful, but this is my first time here. Drew, can you show me around?" The girl had a warm smile on her face. "Of course, come with me. I have to say hello to Godfather first, then I'll introduce you to some interesting guys. How about that?" "No problem," the two women said, then winked at their respective men, then walked away hand in hand. "Let's go to the bar and have a drink." Although Eric had roughly guessed why the student at the door would appear here, he did not mind. If the student at the door stayed close to Microsoft, Eric could not do anything to him. Since he took the initiative to come to his territory, he had to greet him. There was no doubt that the student at the door must have been stimulated by the recent news about him in the media and wanted to join in the fun in Hollywood. In the original spacetime, when Steven Spielberg, David Geffen, and Katzenberg established DreamWorks, Bill Gates and another founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen, had invested in DreamWorks. Later, Microsoft also had the idea of entering Hollywood many times. From time to time, there would be news that Microsoft was about to acquire a media group, but most of the time, it was all talk and no action. But now, history had changed, and the terrifying scale of Firefly Group's profits had obviously made many people determined to enter Hollywood. The student at the door in front of him was probably one of them. However, the 7 major film studios in Hollywood had just been divided up in recent years. At this time, if they wanted to do something in Hollywood, they had to start from scratch. In the past 2 years, Spielberg, David Geffen, and others who had been rumored to want to set up their own film studios had undoubtedly become the best partners for Microsoft. Chapter 781. Microsoft had always had the ambition to expand its territory. Other than operating systems, Microsoft had once been ambitious enough to venture into the MSN web portal business, Xbox game console business, Bing search engine business, and so on. However, he relied on the powerful hindsight that was always slower than others by a lot. None of these projects were successful. With MSN as the core online service, it had lost $13 billion and was eventually forgotten. The Xbox game console had lost $3 billion in 10 years and had barely made it out of the gaming ecosystem. However, it was still far from catching up with PS. The Bing search engine had lost $10 billion and was completely insignificant in front of the mighty Google. Microsoft had also failed in mobile phone, tablet, and social media applications. Microsoft had even tried to acquire Yahoo for $46 billion when their web portals were dying. Luckily, another person who was even more clueless rejected the deal. At the Vanity Fair party, Eric was listening to the men's talk about Microsoft's intention to enter Hollywood. Fine. I should not underestimate them. What if they succeed? But on the surface, Eric frowned and pretended to persuade Bill Gates. Bill, Microsoft's business center should be in the IT industry. I don't think it is a good choice for you all to make movies. How do you know if you don't try? Bill Gates replied confidently. Furthermore, Firefly is also in the IT and media industries. Eric knew that Student Demen was referring to the entire Firefly business empire. He shook his head and said, "This is not the same. Firefly Group and Firefly Investment have always been clearly separated." Bill Gates smiled and took a sip of champagne from the glass in front of him. He didn't believe Eric's words. Entering Hollywood was definitely not the result of Microsoft's whim. This was the result of a detailed analysis of the development of several high-tech companies under Firefly. Take Yahoo, for example. Without the support of the entire Firefly Group in terms of content and marketing resources, this internet company would never have been able to develop so quickly. Yahoo's brand placement in the first movie of Thunderbolt Girls had already become a successful marketing example for many companies to study and emulate. According to statistics, Firefly invested in brands such as Yahoo, AOL, Cisco, and overseas Nokia. Excluding the obvious advertisements, these brands were mentioned more than 300 times in Firefly's huge media channel network every month. This kind of marketing effect that made people think these brands were an inseparable part of their lives was the scariest. On the other hand, although Microsoft had poached Jeff Locke, one of Yahoo's top 3 managers, to be in charge of Microsoft's web portal operations, the MSN web portal launched by Microsoft had improved after a year of development. However, MSN's lack of content was soon exposed. In this regard, Firefly Group and a few of its major allies would definitely not provide any content support to Microsoft. Although they could work with Time Warner and other groups, they would ultimately be under the control of others. Taking advantage of Microsoft's domination of the operating system industry, entering Hollywood and entering the media industry was a good choice. Investing in Spielberg's film studio was only Microsoft's first step into the media industry. Since Jeff Locke left Yahoo last year, there was a slight rift between both parties. Now, they were only pretending to be friendly. After chatting for a while, Bill Gates got up and walked away. Eric asked the waiter to refill his glass and sat at the bar, thinking about the possible consequences of Microsoft entering Hollywood. Although Eric was not optimistic about Microsoft's future in the media industry, he would not underestimate Microsoft. With Microsoft's strength, if Bill Gates was determined to enter the media industry, it would affect his future plans. Based on the current situation in the media industry, other than setting up a new film studio with Spielberg, Microsoft still had 2 other potential targets. They were Sony's Columbia and one of the 4 major public TV stations, CBS. Eric had been secretly keeping an eye on Sony Pictures' Godzilla project. Although the movie had not officially started shooting, they had confirmed that Godzilla's image was very similar to a weak Tyrannosaurus Rex in his previous life. From this point of view, this version of Godzilla was still on the same path. If Godzilla failed next year like in Feng Yu's previous life, Sony's confidence in continuing to operate Columbia will be hit again. This will also be a good opportunity for someone else to take over Columbia Pictures. Eric had intended to give this opportunity to MGM, but with Microsoft's interference, he could not rule out the possibility that MGM would interfere. Another unstable target was CBS. After Viacom's bid for Paramount failed, Barry Diller launched another acquisition of CBS last year. However, when Barry Diller was about to negotiate the acquisition terms with CBS management and major shareholders, Comcast, who was in charge of funding the acquisition, suddenly stopped the project. This caused Barry Diller's return to the media industry to be thwarted again, and CBS returned to the status of being for sale again. Obviously, after setting up a film studio with Spielberg, if Microsoft wanted to go further, Columbia Pictures and CBS would undoubtedly be the best targets. At that time, it would be inevitable for both parties to clash. While Eric was thinking about how to deal with this, Elizabeth and Julia walked over hand in hand. The 2 women were wearing the same spaghetti strap gowns, but one was black and the other was white. It gave off a strange feeling of a couple's outfit. When she walked up to Eric, Julia was like a kitten that had seen its owner. She wanted to rub against Eric with her watery eyes, but Elizabeth pulled her back. "Hey, you are my girlfriend now. It is embarrassing for me to get close to another man like this." Eric smiled helplessly. Elizabeth was now in a state of coming out of the closet. Although everyone knew that she was in a relationship with him, Elizabeth often went out with Julia openly. She even pulled Julia under Fox. At this time, they were filming Shakespeare's Love, that Miramax was in charge of. Because of this, Murdoch even called Eric to ask what was going on. Eric didn't know what to say, so he could only give a perfunctory answer. Murdoch was also worried, not only because of his daughter, but because the old man's eldest son, Lachlan, also had a tendency to have an unknown sexual orientation. He was 25 years old, but he didn't even have a girlfriend. Instead, he liked to hang out with a group of beautiful models. Well, male models. This was actually one of the reasons why Lachlan Murdoch was sent back to his hometown in Australia last year. Patting his left hand, Eric said to Julia, "Ignore her. Come and sit here." Julia shook off Elizabeth and sat on the seat on Eric's left. Elizabeth glared at the two of them, but she sat on Eric's right. Eric gestured for the waiter to prepare drinks for the two women, but Julia leaned over without any scruples. She waved her left hand at Eric and said, "Eric, look, isn't it beautiful?" Eric glanced at it. It was the Four Hearts rose gold ring. He didn't expect Julia to wear it in public. After all, the ring had the Williams emblem tattooed on it. Eric had gotten someone to make a set according to the serial numbers of the playing cards. Now, he only had Virginia, Joanna, Julia, Elizabeth, Drew, Nicole, and Famick. These 7 women still stayed by Eric's side. After spending some time with the other women, Eric either let them go because he felt bored, or his relationship with them naturally cooled. The remaining 37 rings lay quietly in the safe in the Sharp Corner manor. After settling down, Eric was no longer as reckless and frivolous as he was in the first few years. Now, he would rather give a woman a bank card than take out the rings so easily. In the past few years, there were still only 7 women who owned this set of rings. Eric grabbed Julia's hand and admired it for a moment. He smiled and nodded. "Very beautiful." Then he asked Elizabeth, "What about you?" Elizabeth raised her hand and said, "This is Julia's and my couple's ring now. It has nothing to do with you. Haha, Demi Moore just asked me where I bought it." Eric was puzzled. Demi Moore. Elizabeth thought that Eric didn't know who Demi Moore was. She explained, "Bruce Willis's wife. She's a very smart woman." "Oh," Eric replied indifferently. He changed the topic and asked, "Aren't you in charge of the preparations for Star Wars Episode 7 recently? How's the situation?" The news about the Star Wars prequel had never stopped. As an American, almost every piece of news about the movie would cause a heated discussion. Although Eric wasn't interested in the Star Wars series, he was still affected by the countless pieces of news. When she heard Eric mention this, Elizabeth's face immediately became gloomy. She said, "Don't mention it. George Lucas suddenly told us last week that the filming of the movie might be delayed for another half a year. They also revealed that they want to renegotiate the distribution contract." Eric almost immediately thought of the student who had just left. The timing was too coincidental. "Do you know the reason?" Elizabeth turned her head and scanned the hall for a moment. Perhaps she didn't find anyone, so she turned back and said, "Weren't you chatting with Bill Gates just now?" "It's him." "So, Spielberg still wants to pull George Lucas into the upcoming film studio?" Elizabeth had obviously heard the news as well, perhaps even more than Eric. She nodded and said, "Yes, I'm guessing that their target should be Industrial Light and Magic. Because the movie originally planned to cooperate with the digital domain in the special effects department, I even brought another producer to talk to Stan. In the end, last week, when Lucas told me that the filming might be delayed, he also cancelled the cooperation with the digital domain." Eric took a sip of wine and frowned slightly. Although Industrial Light and Magic had been left far behind by the digital domain in the past few years, this special effects studio still had a strong foundation in special effects. They had been left behind by the digital domain in the past few years mainly because the mainstream special effects blockbusters had chosen the digital domain for their special effects production. Without enough projects to develop and accumulate technology, it was inevitable that Industrial Light and Magic would be left behind. However, just like how the Lord of the Rings trilogy supported way to digital, if the special effects of the Star Wars Episode 1 trilogy were all done by Industrial Light and Magic alone, although the production process would be bumpy and the cost would be higher, with the experience of the 3 blockbusters, Industrial Light and Magic special effects standards would catch up very quickly. This was not a good thing for the digital domain. What was even more frustrating was that this kind of thing was very difficult to stop. Because with the increasing demand for special effects in Hollywood movies, no matter how big the digital domain was, it was impossible to swallow all the special effects business. Although Katzenberg was not involved, with Spielberg, David Geffen, and George Lucas, in addition to Microsoft's strong technical and financial support, the new film studio was definitely not to be underestimated. It seemed like Firefly still had to be on their toes to deal with this. Eric, how's the situation with Titanic? I heard that they just finished filming and the production cost has reached $120 million. Elizabeth also asked about the Fireflies. Her tone was filled with concern, but she was also used to gloating a little. Probably, to complete the post-production, the total cost will be $200 million. Eric shrugged. Fortunately, after receiving Eric's promise of sufficient financial support, Cameron did not procrastinate this time. Recently, he had completely completed the filming of the film, and the post-production was quickly underway. $200 million, TSK, with the post-production publicity costs, it will need at least $700 million to break even. Elizabeth shook her head and said, Cameron's box office is at best $500 to $600 million. Yes, I'm very worried too. Eric smiled and looked at Elizabeth. How about Fox help me share some of the cost? Our production budget is $150 million. You can give me another $50 million. Elizabeth was stunned. She looked at Eric and saw that the man's expression was a little strange. He seemed to be joking but also serious. She thought for a while and said, if you really need it, of course I don't mind investing. But, my father will definitely not agree. But Eric had some mischief in his heart. He said, how about this, you talk to your father about this tomorrow and see if he is willing. My father will definitely not be willing. The possibility of this project being profitable is almost zero. Elizabeth said. She felt that Eric's smile was a little naughty. She subconsciously hit him and said, if you want to talk to him yourself. Chapter 782. Elizabeth was only one step away from the CEO position at Fox. Coupled with her special identity as Murdoch's daughter, she had a lot of real power. However, if the company invested more than $50 million in a big project, it must be approved by the board of directors. The chairman of Fox was, of course, her old man. Eric proposed to let Fox participate in part of the investment of Titanic. In fact, he wanted to control Murdoch and secretly fight for more power for Elizabeth. He knew that as a standard businessman, Murdoch would never agree to throw money into a bottomless pit like Titanic. In his previous life, Fox was too shrewd. In order to avoid risks, they sold the North American distribution rights to Paramount for only $60 million. As a result, the box office of Titanic in North America was $600 million, and Fox almost fainted. This time, if Titanic was not a big success, it would be fine. However, if the movie exploded in the box office like the original, Murdoch would definitely pay more attention to Elizabeth's suggestion in the future. Correspondingly, Elizabeth had more decision-making power in the company. The next day, Eric received a call from Elizabeth in his office. The outcome was completely as he had expected. After the Oscar ceremony, Forrest Gump won 6 major awards, including Best Film and Best Director, from 13 nominations. Tom Hanks' consecutive wins became a hot topic in the media. The box office of the movie, which was still screened in hundreds of theaters in North America, rebounded significantly. In the 9th month of the movie's release, it still earned more than $3 million in box office in a single week. Firefly, which had obtained the distribution rights of Forrest Gump in North America, also began the next stage of the movie's release plan. It was Friday at Firefly Studios. After a period of research, Katzenberg presented the evaluation plan of 3D and IMAX technology. According to the detailed research of the Strategic Planning Department, everyone thinks that the current 3D technology may be possible to promote, but IMAX is not. This technology has too many restrictions, and it is impossible to promote it on a large scale. The two were still sitting in a coffee shop in the studio. Eric pushed the coffee aside, flipped through the information compiled by Katzenberg, and asked, "What's the main reason?" Between 3D and IMAX, Eric actually preferred the latter. Perhaps this was the result of too many fake 3D movies in his previous life. The main thing is still the cost. Katzenberg had obviously done a lot of homework. He did not need to flip through the information before he blurted out, Just take the cost of the renovation of the cinema as an example. For 3D, most cinemas only need to change a projection system. The current most advanced polarized 3D movie projector costs only about $100,000. Including the 3D glasses and other hardware, the total renovation cost will not exceed $150,000. However, IMAX was different. Small IMAX screens were as tall as 4 or 5 stories. More than 99% of cinemas in the United States and Europe did not meet the requirements for modification. If you want to build an IMAX theater, you have to start from scratch. The construction of the venue and the projection equipment will cost about $1.5 million, which is 10 times the cost of a 3D theater. After hearing Katzenberg's explanation, Eric suddenly understood why China was the fastest developing region for IMAX technology in his previous life. This was because the popularity of IMAX and the explosion of the film industry happened almost simultaneously. A large number of new cinemas were built with IMAX specifications from the beginning. However, North America and Europe were different. In these areas, the film industry had been developing for hundreds of years. The supporting cinemas had long been finalized. The projection halls of these cinemas were basically not up to IMAX standards. Faced with the high cost of IMAX cinemas, the traditional cinemas were not very enthusiastic about building IMAX cinemas. Lu Zhou flipped through the information in his hand. In addition to the renovation cost of the cinemas, if he wanted to popularize IMAX, from film shooting to film conversion, it was accompanied by a very high cost requirement. Relatively speaking, it was much easier to popularize 3D technology. At present, IMAX technology could not support a full 90-minute movie duration. 3D technology was almost mature. The main reason it could not be popularized was the lack of 3D film sources and 3D cinemas. Even the current reputation of 3D technology was not very good. This was because many cinemas with 3D equipment showed pornographic films that gave people a sense of novelty. Eric was not a blind idealist. He also knew that many things needed to be done step by step. After thinking for a moment, he said, "I saw that IMAX has recently been developing DMR reset technology for converting ordinary film to IMAX film. You can ask someone to pay attention to it. The financial situation of the other party doesn't seem to be very good. We can invest a sum of money in it. Treat it as an angel investment. Also, we can set up a special 3D technology research and development department in the digital field. Well, after I finish shooting Casino Royale, maybe we can try 3D for the next movie." Katzenberg nodded. He had roughly considered Eric's suggestion. However, after Eric finished speaking, Katzenberg continued, "Eric, I also think that 3D technology will definitely be a new development area in the film industry in the next few years. So, don't you think this is a good time for us to enter the cinema industry?" Cinema industry? Eric raised his eyebrows in surprise. He had not considered this matter. Chapter 783. Eric and Katzenberg chatted until it was almost time to get off work. The next 2 days were the weekend, and Katzenberg promised to take his family out for dinner tonight, so he left early. Eric continued to sit in the coffee shop, waiting for the assistant office to send him the recent progress report of Firefly Electronics. The 2 hardware projects of the MP3 player and the ebook reader had been launched for a year. Because it involved the development of the operating system, the design of the processor chip, and many other technical difficulties, the development of the ebook reader was very slow. However, the development of the MP3 player was much smoother. At the end of last year, Eric had already gotten the prototype of the MP3 player developed by Firefly Electronics using Toshiba's 1/8-inch small hard disk. It was a little bigger than a cigarette box, with 270 megabytes of memory, and could store about 50 songs. The prototype was somewhat unsatisfactory in terms of appearance and storage capacity. The only thing that satisfied Eric was that Firefly Electronics had already registered a full set of patent technology for the MP3 player. In this life, there would definitely not be a situation where the patent ownership of the MP3 player was unclear. Even if the MP3 player was completely eliminated in the future, As long as the mobile phone and other electronic devices used MP3-related music playback technology, they would still have to pay patent fees to Firefly Electronics. Flipping through a freshly printed evening newspaper, he waited patiently for more than half an hour. The door of the coffee shop was pushed open, and 3 women walked in, chatting and laughing. Eric looked up and saw Carolyn, Melanie Gleason, and Rachel Wasey. The 3 women were all wearing ordinary casual clothes and jeans, each carrying a bag, and were dressed casually as if they were going shopping. Rachel had recently finished filming Titanic, but she needed to stay in Los Angeles to help with some post-production dubbing work. Naturally, she was with Carolyn and Melanie. Eric was not surprised by this scene. Carolyn was the first to see Eric looking at them. She smiled shyly, and the 3 girls greeted him together and walked over to Eric. Eric asked the waiter to bring a pot of coffee and poured it for the girls. He asked Carolyn, who sat down opposite him, "Are you going shopping?" Carolyn took out a folder from her bag. When she heard Eric's question, she nodded her head and said, "That's right. We don't have to wake up early to work tomorrow. We're planning to watch a movie together tonight." Eric said, "Oh, I don't have any plans tonight. Do you want to bring me along?" Before Carolyn could reply, Melanie and Rachel, who were sitting beside her, said in unison, "No." Carolyn blinked her large, innocent eyes. Looking left and right, she didn't know what to say for a moment. She was very clear about the thoughts of her 2 best friends. They didn't want her to have too much contact with Eric, this playboy. However, these 2 guys, Eric was obviously just joking. "Why did you react so much?" Eric just shrugged and said with a smile, "Okay, but why do I suddenly feel like I have 2 more rivals in love?" When she heard Eric say the words "rivals in love," Carolyn's small face immediately turned red. Rachel had a bold personality. Coupled with the fact that she didn't have much contact with Eric, she didn't have much reverence for him. She hugged Carolyn and kissed her on the cheek. She said in a show of force, "Eric, Carolyn is already mine. You can't casually destroy other people's feelings." "Rachel, let go of me." "It's not like that." Carolyn knew that they were all joking, but she still shyly pushed Rachel away. She didn't forget to explain. Eric took the folder from Carolyn and waved his hand, saying, "It's fine as long as the information is delivered. You can go now. I won't disturb your gathering." Carolyn pulled Rachel, who was about to get up. Opening her bag, she took out a palm-sized box and said, "Eric, there's more. This was sent over from San Francisco this morning." Eric took the box and looked at the Seagate logo printed on the box. He could roughly guess what was inside. After opening the box, there was indeed a postage stamp-sized micro-hard drive. Watching Eric rubbing the micro-hard drive, Carolyn explained, "This is a 256-megabyte sample that Seagate has just developed. According to the information provided by Seagate, they will be able to produce a 512-megabyte new product by the end of the year. The electronics company has already started to design the control chip according to the sample provided by Seagate. It is estimated that they will be able to produce the finished product in the second half of the year. Yahoo's music store has also started the internal testing phase." Mr. Victor Mike Nelly, who is in charge of the electronics company, said in a meeting memo that the company can already consider the next stage of product sales and promotion. Eric played with the micro-hard drive for a moment, put it back into the box, and said, "There's no need to be too anxious about this matter. Wait for them to come up with a stable 512-megabyte product, then we can consider the next stage. Well, after I finish reading this information over the weekend, I will call Victor personally to talk about it. The player's capacity is 512 megabytes, which is about enough to hold 10 albums. Only then can it be considered to have completely widened the gap with traditional players. If the capacity is smaller, it won't be attractive enough to consumers." After Eric finished speaking, he saw Carolyn nodding her head. Her big eyes were looking at him as if she was waiting for him to instruct her on something. He said, "Is there anything else?" "No." Carolyn shook her head subconsciously. Eric only felt that adding a strand of hair on Carolyn's small head could invade the two-dimensional world. He couldn't help but chuckle and said, "Then you can go now. Or, do you really want me to go to the movies with you tonight?" As soon as Eric's voice fell, Rachel and Melanie got up with a smile. They pulled Carolyn up with a blushing face, said goodbye, and left the cafe. Mission Impossible 2 was also confirmed to be filmed in Australia. Drew recently went to Australia with Amy Pascal to visit the set. After the Oscars, Julia returned to the UK to continue filming Shakespeare's Love, and Elizabeth also followed. Nicole and Famke Jensen were also not in Los Angeles. After Carolyn and the other two left, Eric realized that he would have to spend the weekend alone again. The preliminary preparations for Casino Royale were basically completed. According to the schedule, Eric also needed to leave Los Angeles next month. Before the movie started filming, he had to personally visit the main filming locations that had been confirmed. 007's filming always required him to travel all over the world. This time was no exception. The planned filming locations included the UK, Italy, the Czech Republic, and the Bahamas. Eric's previous films, even Jurassic Park, were all filmed in a very centralized location. Therefore, this movie could be considered a challenge for Eric. Once he got busy in April, he might have to wait until Casino Royale finished filming at the end of the year. As Eric was thinking about how to spend the rest of the weekend, the phone on the table buzzed. A few minutes later, Eric's car stopped on the side of the road outside the studio. The door opened from the inside, and Eric waved to the two tall girls standing on the side of the road. "Get in." Giselle Bundchen and Alexandria Ambrosio got into the car one after another. Alexandria closed the door a little gloomily and looked at Giselle, who was leaning over and hugging Eric. Eric patted Giselle's soft waist and let go of her. He smiled at Alexandria and asked, "Why are you in Los Angeles?" In fact, Eric was more curious about how the two girls got Kapoor to contact him. He was not the kind of person who would easily give his contact information to others. Giselle and Alexandria did not have his phone number. However, after thinking about it, this matter should be pushed by the agencies behind the two girls. Most famous models had individual contracts with Hollywood agencies. The relationship between the modeling agencies and the actors' agencies was very close. Kapoor was probably just doing them a favor. The company arranged 2 weeks of short-term actor training for us in Santa Monica. We've been here for 5 days. Giselle still suppressed her hoarse voice and whispered. There was some excitement and a hint of bitterness from seeing Eric again. When they came to Los Angeles, they thought it would be easy to see Eric, but they realized that he was so far away from them. They could see his name in countless newspapers and magazines, hear people talking about him everywhere, and feel his influence everywhere in the city. However, if they really wanted to see him, they had nowhere to go. A few days ago, the two girls even secretly went to Malibu to see the Pointy Corner Manor that countless people yearned for. At that time, they wanted to take the initiative to visit, but when they reached the gate of the manor, they did not have the courage in the end. They were worried that it would be too abrupt and make Eric feel disgusted. In the end, the executives of the two agencies took the initiative to ask about it, so they helped arrange it. Eric could sense the faint emotions in Giselle's tone. He smiled and did not say anything. Although the roles of the girls in Casino Royale were just fleeting, he would not object to others treating this matter seriously. Looking at his watch, Eric instructed the driver to go to Venice Beach and said to the two girls, "It's dinner time. Let's have dinner together. Well, maybe you can call Miranda and meet her." Eric hadn't mentioned anything about Miranda Kerr, and Giselle's agency wouldn't have noticed such an insignificant arrangement. Seeing the confusion on the two girls' faces, Eric explained, "Her name is Miranda Kerr. She'll appear with you." Alexander couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. What about the three of us? They were not worried that a small scene would be distracted by someone else. After all, this scene was more symbolic for them. Adding one more person meant that they would have one more competitor in the future. According to the information obtained by their agency, the 5 spokespersons of Victoria's Secret Angel, Cindy Crawford and Linda Evangelista, the 2 first-generation supermodels, would not renew their contracts with Victoria's Secret after the 5-year contract was completed. In addition to the age factor, the most important thing was that the two would focus on the reality show in their hands. When the time came, Giselle and Linda would be able to fight for one vacancy each. Now that a girl named Miranda Kerr had suddenly appeared, the two girls could not help but feel a sense of crisis. However, Eric's next words made the two girls even more nervous. Not 3, 4. This time, even Giselle was a little uneasy. She exclaimed softly in surprise. Eric felt that teasing these two beauties was quite interesting, so he did not explain in detail. The car arrived at Venice Beach. Eric chose a restaurant with good privacy and ordered the driver to pick up Miranda Kerr. Miranda Kerr was arranged to stay with a middle-level manager of Firefly. The family lived in Santa Monica and the girl had also been transferred to Santa Monica High School. After several rounds of auditions, she got a permanent role in a family sitcom on the Disney Channel and settled down in Los Angeles. Half an hour later, Eric was chatting casually with Giselle and Alexander when Miranda came over under the guidance of the waiter. Seeing Eric and the other two unfamiliar girls sitting next to him, Miranda was almost instinctively vigilant, but she quickly pounced on Eric like a spoiled child. "Don't mess around, someone is here." Eric quickly got up, caught the girl's soft body, and put her down next to him. Although he deliberately chose a booth, it was not a private room after all. If they made too much noise, it was inevitable that they would be surrounded. Miranda sat down obediently and glanced at the two girls who were also scrutinizing her. She quickly turned to Eric and said with a little resentment, "You ignored me for almost a month, I thought you forgot about me." "You know I'm very busy," Eric explained, took the menu, and motioned for the girls to start ordering. When the waiter with envious eyes completely walked away, the atmosphere in the booth was a little strange. "Hey, this is Giselle Bündchen and Alexander Ambrosio, they are from Brazil. This is Miranda Kerr, from Australia." Eric took the initiative to introduce the three girls to each other. He thought that the supermodels of the beginning of the century were almost all gathered. "Hello." Miranda sat next to Eric and just waved at the other two girls. Giselle and Alexander, who had wanted to get up and shake hands with Miranda, sat back down and politely waved at her. After a short chat, Miranda keenly felt that Giselle and Alexander were cautious in front of Eric and realized that their relationship with Eric was definitely not as close as her relationship with him. She could not help but have a faint sense of superiority and said, "So, the three of us are going to be in that scene together?" "No, it's 4. Alexander, who was sitting opposite Miranda, saw that Miranda did not know about this and took the initiative to add. Miranda looked at Eric in confusion. Eric smiled and said, "Guess who the last one is?" "It's easy to guess." Chapter 784. Both Giselle and Alexander were confused. Their understanding of Eric was limited to what they had heard after coming to the United States. It was impossible for them to know certain things. After a moment of confusion, Miranda's eyes lit up. She glanced at the two women opposite her proudly and asked Eric, "Is there a reward for guessing correctly?" Eric smiled and said, "You have to guess correctly first." Miranda blurted out, "It's the little girl holding a doll, right? That girl is in your previous movies. She seems to be called Ivanka. She should be the same age as us now." Eric snapped his fingers and said, "Bingo." "Then, what about the reward?" Eric said shamelessly, "I didn't agree to it just now." Miranda immediately hugged Eric's arm and shook it coquettishly. Okay. Eric quickly surrendered and said, "What do you want?" Miranda rolled her eyes and said, "It's my birthday on the 20th of next month. Can you celebrate it with me?" Eric shook his head regretfully and said, "I should be in Europe at that time. I can only get someone to send you a birthday present. Do you have any birthday wishes? Tell me." "As long as it's from you, I'll like it," Miranda said, still a little disappointed. "Actually, I just want you to celebrate my birthday with me. Next time." "I really don't have time this time." Giselle and Alexander listened to the interaction between Eric and Miranda with some envy. As two girls from a small town in Brazil, they had only watched a few movies since they were young. They did not know what the so-called little girl holding a doll was. In his heart, he was planning to go back and watch all of Eric's movies. When he heard the two talk about birthdays, Alexander hesitated and whispered with some anticipation, "Eric, My birthday is next month, the 11th. No problem. I'll buy you a gift then, Eric said and looked at Giselle. Giselle smiled and shook her head. Her birthday was on July 14th. She was a little regretful, but she was also looking forward to it. She hoped that she would be able to make it in time for the movie shooting. Miranda was a little depressed by Alessandra's sudden interruption. She rolled her eyes and joked, "Eric, if you know enough girls, will you have to celebrate someone's birthday every day?" Why does the situation you're talking about sound a little scary? Hee. After dinner, it was only 8 o'clock in the evening. Hearing that Eric was going to send her back, Miranda immediately acted coquettishly. After bargaining for a while, the four of them decided to go to the movies together. It was Easter next week, and Red Flower happened to be released today. Eric chose this movie to see how the movie was received in North America. In order to build momentum for Rush Hour at the end of the year and to make Jack Ching famous in North America, Eric spared no effort in investing in Red Flower. In addition to the $5 million buyout fee that broke the record for Hong Kong films, the new line also invested no less than $5 million in publicity budget. The total cost had exceeded the $7.5 million production cost of the movie. The number of screens for the movie also reached 2,000. It could be said that it was the first time a Hong Kong film was released on such a large scale in North America. Before this, except for Bruce Lee's kung fu movies, most Hong Kong films could only earn millions at the box office in North America. There were very few that could reach tens of millions at the box office. Although Red Cross had achieved very bright box office results in Asia, New Line was still prepared to make a loss with a total investment of more than $10 million. Fortunately, the management was full of confidence in the future of Rush Hour, so the possible loss of Red Cross was within an acceptable range. Eric and the three girls found a theater nearby that was showing Red Flower. They walked into the theater with a bunch of snacks. Although the film was rated R, Giselle and Alexander, who were tall and sexy, didn't encounter any obstacles when they bought the tickets. Although Miranda's baby face was a little conspicuous, with Eric accompanying her, they didn't encounter any obstacles when they entered the theater. After finding a row of seats at the back, the three girls sat down around Eric. Eric looked around. This was a medium-sized theater with a capacity of about 100 people. At this time, there were still more than 10 minutes before the movie started. The screen was playing advertisements and there were about 20 people sitting around. When the movie started, 5 or 6 people came in one after another. The theater barely reached 30% occupancy. If it was a blockbuster like Jurassic Park, 30% occupancy on the first day would definitely be described as a flop. However, for a Hong Kong film that wasn't popular in North America to begin with, it was already a pleasant surprise that 30% of the seats were occupied. Miranda wasn't interested in the film that Eric had chosen at all, but she was very satisfied with the somewhat empty environment in the screening hall. In this way, even if he did some dirty tricks, no one would be able to notice. Although Giselle and Alexander were both taller than her, and their figures seemed to be better than hers, Miranda still looked down on these two little girls from Brazil. They couldn't even speak English well, so how could they have the strength to compete with her? The lights in the theater dimmed, and the girls in the dark immediately began to get restless. Eric stared at the screen intently and casually took a few mouthfuls of the creamy popcorn that the girl handed over. Soon, he felt that Miranda had moved from the seat next to him to his arms. He had already seen how unscrupulous this little vixen was that night, so he was not surprised. He just reached out and put his arm around the girl's waist to prevent her from moving. He warned with a smile, "If you don't watch the movie properly, I won't bring you here next time." Miranda clung to Eric softly and leaned over to his ear. She whispered, "Eric, your hand is too tight. I can't breathe." "It's okay. If you faint, I'll give you mouth-to-mouth resuscitation." Miranda was still breathing hot air in Eric's ear. "Let's do it now." "Oh, I'm so dizzy." "Stop fooling around. Let's watch the movie." Really, she's already so proactive. Giselle and Alessandra did not pay much attention to the movie. At this time, the two girls stared at Miranda, who was in Eric's arms, and the same thought came to their minds at the same time. This can also be done? Under Eric's suppression, Miranda quickly calmed down, and their minds turned to the movie again. Red Patrol was definitely a work of conscience. With a cost of $7.5 million, it could only be regarded as a low-budget film for Hollywood movies. However, there were all kinds of car chases, gunfights, and even hot scenes of houses collapsing in the movie. Although many of the settings were a bit rough, if the same level of production was used by a Hollywood team, the cost would definitely skyrocket to more than $30 million. Giselle and Alessandra were a bit reserved when watching the movie, but Miranda had no scruples. Her mind turned to the movie, and she was soon attracted by the plot. Wow, Kung Fu is so good. Oh, it must be very painful to fall like this. Ha ha ha, it can actually be like this. It's so funny to plunge into a car. Wow, can a hovercraft run on the road? Could there be a car underneath? Although there were only more than 30 people in the screening hall, the girls' comments did not attract any special attention because most people were either amazed or laughing along with the movie's plot. The audience gradually forgot the fact that this was a non-Hollywood movie amidst the various exciting and funny plots. After the movie, Eric patiently waited for the audience to leave before putting on the sunglasses hanging on his collar. He patted Miranda, who was still in his arms, and said, "Okay, let's go." "Okay." Miranda turned her head and whispered in his ear, "Eric, can I go to your place tonight?" "That won't do. You still have to go to school." Eric casually found an excuse. Miranda pursed her lips and said, "You forgot, tomorrow is the weekend." "You don't like staying at John's house?" Eric pulled the girl up and said as he got up and walked out. When they came to the aisle, Miranda took Eric's hand and continued, "Of course it's good. You arranged it. How could they not treat me well? It's just that I want to spend the weekend at your place. And, don't worry, they definitely won't tell my parents." Eric wouldn't go along with this little minx's wishes and add some potential trouble to himself. He shook his head firmly and said, "In that case, go back obediently. You're still young and don't know what you're doing." Miranda was very disappointed and said, "I know. It's even worse if you do it knowingly." Miranda shook Eric's arm and said, "Eric, you're so annoying. You're also a coward." Although a little reluctant, Eric then asked the driver to turn to Miranda's place first. After watching the girl enter the door, he ordered the driver to drive. Seeing Miranda leave, Giselle and Alexander, who had been a little quiet, breathed a sigh of relief. To be honest, with this little minx by Eric's side, they found it difficult to get much attention from Eric. However, when they remembered the last time in New York when Eric sent them back, Giselle and Alexander quickly became a little worried. Would Eric send them back to the hotel like last time? If that was the case, they didn't know when they would meet again. The car drove out of Miranda's residential area. Eric asked Giselle next to him, "Do you have classes on the weekend? I mean, the performance training class?" Giselle realized something and shook her head with some joy. "No." "Then come to my place for the weekend. I happen to be alone these 2 days. It's quite boring." "Okay." Giselle nodded without hesitation and looked at Alexander on the other side. Thinking of the comments she received from the psychic medium in New York last time, her face couldn't help but heat up a little, but she couldn't resist in her heart. Eric didn't have any strong desire for Giselle and Alexander. What he didn't lack now was women, so it was impossible for him to be controlled by pure carnal desire. Bringing the two girls back was really just a boring weekend. He hoped to have 2 beautiful vases by his side to accompany him. That was how the saying goes, beautiful women to accompany him. If it wasn't for Miranda Kerr's behavior being a little too unscrupulous, Eric actually didn't mind bringing the girls to the Sharphorn Manor for the weekend. Miranda was very similar to Drew back then, but fundamentally different. Drew was very simple and infatuated, and Eric could be sure that the girl would never do anything that could hurt him. Miranda, on the other hand, was like a shrewd and greedy little beast. She was very clear about what she wanted, and she was willing to give up everything for it without any hesitation. If her desire was not satisfied, this little beast would probably bare her little white teeth. Eric had always been very generous to women, but the premise was that he was willing and not forced to be a sucker. It was already 11 o'clock when they returned to the Sharphorn Manor. Following Eric into the shell villa that she had yearned for a long time, Giselle looked at the sensor lights in the hall that lit up one by one. The first reaction she had after living a poor life since young was how much electricity she would use in a month. Immediately, the girl felt her cheeks heat up. If Eric or Alessandra could see what she was thinking, they would definitely laugh to death. Eric happened to turn his head at this time and noticed the strange expression on Giselle's face. He asked with concern, "What's wrong?" "No, nothing." Giselle quickly shook her head. Eric saw her holding her bag with both hands and pressing it on her lower abdomen. He smiled and said, "Are you hungry?" A few hours ago, Eric noticed that the two girls didn't eat much in the dining room. Giselle shook her head again and said, "No, Eric, I'm not hungry." Eric thought Giselle was embarrassed, so he took the two girls to the kitchen and said, "Actually, I'm a little hungry too. You guys make some supper. I'm going to take a shower first." Giselle wanted to say something, but Eric waved his hand and turned to leave. Alexander waited for Eric's figure to disappear. With a teasing smile, he asked in Portuguese, "What were you thinking about?" Portuguese was the mother tongue of the two girls. Compared to English, they preferred or were better at Portuguese when chatting in private. Giselle looked guiltily at the direction Eric disappeared. She shook her head and replied in Portuguese, "I didn't." Giselle didn't continue the topic with Alexander. She put her bag aside and walked to the fridge. Alexander also followed and picked out ingredients with Giselle. He still murmured in Portuguese, "I don't know if it will hurt." Giselle, who was absent-minded, looked up and asked, "What? I mean, that should be very painful." Giselle finally understood and said, You haven't done it before." Alexander nodded, blushed, and whispered, "I hope Eric is a gentle man." Chapter 785. Eric took a shower and went downstairs. Giselle and Alessandra had already cooked the oatmeal with milk. Perhaps it was because the topic they had just discussed was too sensitive, but the expressions on the two girls' faces were a little uneasy as they ate supper. Their hearts were always a little nervous and expectant, and they were embarrassed because they might have to eat together. Eric looked at the two girls who were eating the porridge like cats, as if they were trying to delay something. Of course, he knew what they were thinking and joked, "Eat more. You might be tired later." Giselle and Alessandra blushed at the same time, but they thought that Eric was getting impatient, so they ate faster. After eating, it was almost 12 o'clock. Eric brought the two girls to a guest room on the second floor. He opened the door and gestured for the two behind him to enter. Giselle and Alessandra walked in and looked around the spacious bedroom. The room was about 50 square meters. There was a big bed on the left side of the wall, surrounded by simple but exquisite furniture and appliances. There was also a door on the innermost side, which should be the bathroom. The south side of the bedroom was a glass wall. Although the lights in the bedroom were bright, they could still see the faint starlight and the dark sea through the glass wall. It was the first time the two girls came to the Sharphorn Manor, so they subconsciously thought that this bedroom was the master bedroom. Walking to the bed, the two girls turned around and looked at Eric cautiously. Eric leaned against the door and looked at the two girls for a while before saying, "There are spare toiletries in the bathroom. They are all new. Go to bed early after washing up. It's already very late." Alessandra was stunned when she heard Eric's words. Under normal circumstances, the plot shouldn't be like this. Giselle's reaction was similar to Alessandra's, but she quickly reacted. After a brief moment of relief, she became nervous again. She knew that if they wanted to get Eric's help and support, their bodies were the only bargaining chip they could offer. If Eric didn't want it, then what could they offer? Giselle quickly gathered her courage and walked over. She raised her hand, but put it down helplessly. She whispered, "Eric, aren't you going to sleep here?" Alexander came back to his senses and walked over as well. "Eric, you can stay." Eric smiled and reached out to lift Alessandra's cheeks. His index finger brushed across the girl's pink lips. He felt the girl's gentle tongue lick his fingertip before he retracted his finger and said, "Don't wear pink lips in the future. This color doesn't suit you. It's ugly." When Alessander heard this, he subconsciously raised his hand to wipe off the lip gloss, but he remembered that it was not appropriate to do so. It would definitely turn the corners of his mouth pink, so he could only put down his hand awkwardly. "Well, go to bed early," Eric said. He looked at Giselle and smiled. "You two will be mine sooner or later. You can't run away. So, don't think too much. Of course, don't let me down." As soon as Eric closed the door, Alessander immediately raised her hand impatiently and walked to the bathroom while wiping her lips. Giselle followed into the bathroom and saw Alessander wiping her lips with a towel in her hand. She couldn't help revealing a gloating smile. Alessander glanced at Giselle, but there was nothing she could do. She could only mumble as she wiped, "I won't let Sandra provide fashion advice for me anymore. Oh my God, Eric must hate my lip gloss. That's why he said that earlier." Giselle walked to the sink and opened the cabinet by the side. She took out a new toothbrush and toothpaste and smiled. "I think it looks pretty good. Hee hee, pink lip gloss makes you look more like a little girl." Alessander wiped her lip gloss clean. When she heard Giselle's words, she understood something and said, You saw through it long ago?" Giselle did not answer. She picked up the cup and started brushing her teeth. She naturally saw through it long ago. Alessander was younger than her by a year. They were both young and inexperienced. If they did not dress up more mature and wore pink lip gloss instead, it would definitely be inappropriate. However, she did not feel that she had any obligation to remind Alessander. After the two girls washed up with their own thoughts, they put on a bathrobe and walked out of the bathroom. When they came to the bed, they realized another thing. The two of them were going to sleep in the same bed tonight. Although the bed was big, for some reason, it felt weird. Looking at each other, the two girls had the same thought. Could it be that Eric did it on purpose? After all, such a big villa must have a lot of rooms. It was already past midnight. The two girls were sleepy at the same time. Although they had these thoughts, they didn't think too much about it. Giselle went to turn off the light. When she came back, she slowly climbed into the bed. Alessander was already lying on the other side. She took off her bathrobe and pulled a thin quilt to cover her body. Lying on the soft bed, her sleepiness inexplicably dissipated a lot. "Hey, what do you think that guy would do if he was here?" Alessander suddenly asked. Giselle knew that Alessander was talking about Miranda Kerr. She turned her body to face Alessander and replied, she would definitely sneak into Eric's room. After she said this, there was a short silence in the bedroom. After a minute or two, Alessander opened her mouth again with some eagerness in her tone. "Then, do you dare to go?" In the darkness, Giselle blinked her eyes and quickly said, "If you dare to go, I dare to." "How about," Alessander hesitated for a moment and said, "How about, we go together?" Giselle said, "You made the suggestion. You go first." Alessander moved her body and said, "I thought you were braver than me." Giselle didn't have any intention to argue with her and said, "I've always been timid." Alessander snorted and sat up and said, "Then don't follow me." Giselle simply ignored her and turned her back to Alessander. Alessander bit her lips and quickly made up her mind. She got out of bed and put on the bathrobe. Without turning on the light, she groped her way out of the door. Hearing the slight sound of the door opening and closing, Giselle lay back comfortably and stretched her body with a sly smile on her face. Idiot, Eric knew that the girl named Miranda would do this at night, so he didn't bring her back. Giselle narrowed her eyes and patiently waited for the next good show. After an unknown amount of time, the door was gently pushed open. Giselle immediately propped herself up and looked from the bed. In the dim light, she saw Alessander walking back alone. Alessander walked to the bedside and sat down before softly saying, This place is too big. I can't find Eric's room." Giselle lay down on the bed in disappointment. Alas, she really is an idiot. They fell asleep very late. In an unfamiliar environment, they forgot to close the curtains. When the sun rose, Giselle and Alessander woke up together. Realizing that they were very close to each other, and that Giselle's hand was still on Alessandra's waist, the two girls were a little embarrassed and quickly woke up. After putting on their clothes and washing up, they walked out of the room. The villa was unusually quiet in the early morning, and the sound of their high heels on the floor was very clear. This made the two girls at the same time lighten their footsteps. Later, Giselle simply took off her high boots, and Alessandra did the same. They carefully went downstairs like two curious cats, taking advantage of the fact that their owner was sleeping soundly. They walked around the villa barefoot without making a sound. Living room, gym, library, dining room, kitchen. In the end, they were attracted by the scenery outside the glass wall in the hall. They huddled together in two space chairs that looked like handicrafts by the wall, admiring the surging waves of the ocean that looked like a real-life IMAX version. It was still sunny in Los Angeles, and the sky was mesmerizingly blue. The morning sun had just peeked out of the horizon, and the sparkling sea in the breeze seemed to be inlaid with countless golden accessories. A few seabirds gliding between the sky and the sea were perfectly embellished, adding a bit of vitality to the whole scene. The space chair under her was like a water droplet hanging on a stainless steel skeleton, gently swaying like a swing. Giselle's toes touched the ground, gently swaying, and unconsciously taking a deep breath. She suddenly felt that this might be the life she yearned for. Unfortunately, she was just a passerby here. I have decided that I want to have a house like this in the future, where I can sit by the window and eat breakfast every day. Alessandra was also full of yearning, but when he heard Giselle's words, he couldn't help but say, "Wake up, we can never afford such a house in our lifetime. Moreover, it is said that this villa is unique in the world. You can't buy it even if you have the money." Giselle suddenly had an unyielding momentum and said, "Even if it can't be exactly the same as here, it should be similar. Moreover, even if you don't want such a house in your lifetime, why drag me into it?" "Who said I don't want it?" "You just said it yourself." "I'm just stating a fact. The future hasn't happened yet. How do you know this is a fact?" Alessandra felt that Giselle was a bit aggressive and retreated, "I'm not going to argue with you about this." Just as they were talking, Eric's voice suddenly came from behind the two girls. "What are you talking about?" Giselle and Alessandra jumped down from the space chair at the same time with a panicked expression. However, when they realized that they had just spoken in Portuguese and Eric couldn't understand, they were relieved. Eric looked at Giselle's and Alessandra's bare feet and smiled. "Where are your shoes?" "Oh, over there." Alessandra pointed to the stairs and subconsciously replied in Portuguese, then quickly repeated it in English. Eric didn't let the two girls wear high boots. He took them to the gym for their routine morning exercise and then made breakfast together. At about 8 o'clock, Eric sat at the round table where he often worked by the curtain wall. On the table was a laptop, a few documents, and a clipboard. Giselle was sent by Eric to get today's newspaper. Alessandra sat opposite Eric curiously and casually chatted. Talking about what happened in the morning, Alessandra told Eric about Giselle's ambition. Eric smiled and said, "Don't you want to?" "Of course, who doesn't want to?" Alessandra leaned on the opposite side of the round table and supported her chin with one hand and said, "I just think that it would be very tiring. I think that people shouldn't live too easily. You should give yourself some pressure." Alessandra slightly pouted her lips. Today, she didn't wear any lip gloss. The color of her lips was natural and her whole face looked sweeter. "I just think," Alessandra thought for a while and said shamelessly with a smile, "I'm a woman. I don't need to be so tired." "Oh." Eric shook his head. He liked ambitious women, but he didn't dislike girls who liked to enjoy. Perhaps, as Alessandra said, they were women, and beautiful women at that. Their tolerance for men would always be higher. Giselle came back with a stack of newspapers and sat down next to Eric. Just as she was about to say something, she looked around and saw that the two of them seemed to have cut off the conversation. She suddenly realized that they might have been talking about her just now. Her expression was a little unnatural. Giselle gathered her courage and asked, "Eric, what were you talking about just now?" "You." Eric took the newspaper, opened it, and smiled casually. "The ambitious girl from Brazil." Giselle understood that Alessander must have told Eric what she said in the morning. Giselle glared at Alessander and wanted to explain something, but she didn't know where to start. Eric caught a glimpse of Giselle's expression and took the initiative to help her out. Actually, I like girls who are ambitious. Really? Giselle asked embarrassedly. Of course, Eric nodded with a smile. He couldn't help but think of Giselle in the original spacetime. That was simply a miracle in the modeling world. Many times, on the annual Forbes supermodel income list, Giselle had an income of tens of millions of dollars, leaving other supermodels who only had an annual income of $1 million far behind. Thinking about it carefully, in addition to her income as a supermodel, Giselle's other income mainly came from her series of keen investments in business. Eric liked miracles. If miracles were associated with women, it would even be more pleasing to the eye. Thinking of this, Eric suddenly felt that why not create a miracle with his own hands? Moreover, there was a very good template in front of him. He could push Giselle to a higher position than in his previous life, just like Drew. Eric had never been a hesitant person. He would do what he thought. Looking at Giselle, Eric said, "If you really want, maybe I can help you achieve this dream." Ah. Giselle was a little surprised. After a moment of hesitation, she asked, "Then, what do I need to pay?" Chapter 786. Very good. Too many people like to reap without sowing. Very few people can consciously understand the principle that if you want to get something, you have to pay for it. Eric nodded and continued, "Under normal circumstances, a person often needs to sell their soul to the devil for this type of transaction." Ah. Giselle opened her mouth and was a little frightened. "But I'm not a devil, and I'm not interested in your soul." Eric shrugged, but with a devilish smile he said, "So, I only want your flesh." Giselle suddenly fell into silence. Eric opened the newspaper in front of him and said, "Well, you can think about it." Giselle was not silent for too long. She quickly asked, "Eric, can I ask, what exactly can I get?" Eric thought for a while and said, "You will probably become the second Drew." With the support of Eric and the shares of MGM, Drew had become the world's youngest billionairess, and there was no one else who could compare to her. The women who approached Eric more or less had the idea of becoming the second Drew. Giselle suddenly felt that if she, a small-town girl from Brazil, could reach the height of Drew in this life, even if she sold her soul, her flesh to the devil, there was nothing wrong with it. Of course, she also knew that Eric's promise at this time could not appear in any written contract. Perhaps, there was no 100% chance of success, but she had always been a decisive girl. She knew that even so, the promise of the young man in front of her was not something that any woman could easily get. After deliberating for a moment, Giselle looked at the man opposite her and said firmly, "Eric, I'm willing." Eric raised his head again and was a little surprised by Giselle's decisiveness. He smiled and said, "Have you really thought about it?" Then, let's talk about the next thing," Eric continued. "First of all, you need a public partner to facilitate your future media image. Since you are my woman, this partner definitely cannot be a man. So, from today onwards, you are a lesbian." Hearing this, Giselle subconsciously turned her head and looked at Alexander. Alexander originally had an expression of watching the fun, but when he saw Giselle suddenly looking at him, he shrunk his neck and mumbled, What are you looking at me for?" Eric's lips curled into a mischievous smile as he said, "Very good. You've already found your target. I also think that Alexander is quite suitable. So, kiss him for me to see." Without hesitation, Giselle put her arms around Alexander and leaned over to kiss him. When their red lips met, Alexander quickly blinked a few times and was stunned for a while. When she came to her senses, she wanted to push Giselle away, but Giselle had already pressed her down on the sofa. Her hand even reached into her clothes. "Oh my God!" Alexander, who was pressed down on the sofa, wailed in his heart. What the medium said was true. But why am I the one being bullied? Sigh, is this my fate? Eric enjoyed the pleasing Yuri game of the two girls opposite him. He put down the newspaper, opened the email in his laptop, and sent out an email. Then, he began to check his work email for the day. The box office statistics for the first day of Red Flower, released yesterday, were out. The relevant data had been sent to Eric's email on time. With the release of nearly 2,000 screens, Red Flower grossed $3.6 million on its first day. This was almost the best opening day result for a Hong Kong film in recent years. Even more than 90% of Hong Kong films that could be released in North American cinemas did not necessarily gross $3.6 million in North American box office. This also showed that Jack Cheng's humorous skills were very popular in North America. At the same time, a few weeks before Easter was a period of time when the North American film market was in a slump. The films released at the end of the year were already in the final stage, and the new films that the film companies were very optimistic about would not be released at this time. Therefore, Red Flower easily topped the box office on Friday with its $3.6 million one-day box office. According to the usual 3-day weekend box office curve, the box office on Saturday would be higher than the box office on Friday, and the box office on Sunday would be the same as the box office on Friday. Therefore, the box office of Red Flower was expected to be around $11 million. If the box office curve of Red Flower for today and tomorrow could really follow this trend, the 7-day box office in the first week could even gross $16 million. This figure far exceeded the expectations of New Line Distribution. Eric remembered that in the original Spacetime, the total box office of Red Flower in North America was only about $30 million. But now, with a larger scale of marketing and screening, this figure would definitely surpass the original. If Red Flower could break out of the box office curve of a normal Hollywood commercial film, the total box office could even hit $50 million. Eric did not expect the film to be able to make a long run at the box office. After all, the audience of Hong Kong films in North America was limited. After the box office hit a high in the first week, Red Flower was likely to fall by 50% the next week. Of course, if the total box office could reach $50 million, it would be a box office miracle in recent years. Red Flower was just a warm-up for Jack Cheng's fame. It was building the popularity foundation for Rush Hour, to be released at the end of the year. The company's most important film was 7 Deadly Sins, which had been intensively promoted for more than 2 months. This film was scheduled to be released next week, April 5th. Eric found another movie schedule for next week. 7 Deadly Sins was firmly at the top of the list with 2,500 screens. Eric casually glanced down and was about to close the email interface when he had a flash of inspiration. He was attracted by the name of a movie. This film was called Primal Fear, which translated into Chinese was Level 1 Fear. Level 1 Fear was the famous work of Edward Norton. This film was about a male and female lawyer who had emotional entanglements. The story revolved around a suspected schizophrenic patient who was suspected of murder. Lawyer Martin, played by Richard Gere, finally succeeded in proving that Alan, played by Edward Norton, had schizophrenia and was not responsible for the murder. However, there was a shocking twist at the end of the film. It turned out that everything was just a scam. As a crime thriller, the plot of Level 1 Terror was a bit long and sluggish. Edward Norton's amazing acting skills could be said to be the only 2 points in the film. He himself was nominated for numerous awards because of this film and quickly became popular in Hollywood. Recalling this information, Eric opened the IMDb website and found the page of Level 1 Fear. He found that Edward Norton was not swept away by the butterfly's wings and still successfully got the role of Alan. It was only a week before the release of the film. There were already several reviews from professional film critics on the movie page. Eric opened a review. The author column was labeled as The Seattle Times resident film critic, Stephen Gary. After reading a few paragraphs, Eric frowned slightly. I've been invited to watch 2 excellent crime thrillers in a week. The fear and shock left in me by 7 Deadly Sins hasn't dissipated yet. The newcomer actor named Edward Norton in Level 1 Terror gave me the chills again. In the 2 films, Kevin Spacey, who was already a little famous, and Edward Norton, who was also from Broadway, gave us 2 somewhat similar roles. Kevin Spacey successfully portrayed a cold and crazy murderer. In the short time he appeared, the impression he left on me was no less than Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. However, as a newcomer to Hollywood, Edward Norton's performance is obviously better than Kevin Spacey's. The ability to control the role like a chameleon, the violent and fierce soul under the innocent and pure appearance is exposed to the audience through the film screen. It can't help but have a creepy feeling that can't be calmed down for a long time. Although the author of the review maintained a positive attitude towards the two movies, Eric saw a clear hint of flattery in it. The review didn't do a detailed comparison of the plot, characters, performance and other factors of the two movies. It only focused on Edward Norton's wonderful performance in Level 1 Fear, and compared his performance with Kevin Spacey's. It clearly expressed the view that Kevin Spacey was not as good as Edward Norton. If an ordinary audience saw this review, they would definitely be more curious about Level 1 Fear, and would be more inclined towards the latter when choosing to watch the movie. Putting the review aside, Eric knew very well that Edward Norton was definitely not as good as Kevin Spacey when it came to acting. In the original Space-Time, Edward Norton's acting path was actually very narrow. He was only good at playing the role of a schizophrenic with a huge contrast between the outside and the inside. That was why movies like Level 1 Fear, American X-Files, and Fight Club were so popular. But other than that, Edward Norton's acting in other movies could not be said to be bad, but it was difficult to see where he stood out. Some of his roles even made people feel inexplicably like they were acting. Kevin Spacey was different. He could be the cold and crazy murderer in 7 Deadly Sins. He could be the sensitive and dull single father in True Love Express. He could be the mature and experienced politician in House of Cards. He could be the stingy and harsh boss in Evil Boss. He could be the husband in American Beauty. He could be the calm and wise negotiator in Ace Against Ace. It should be said that Kevin Spacey could be 1,000 different versions of Kevin Spacey in 1,000 movies, but Edward Norton's acting style was very distinct. He could only be Edward Norton. After reading the review again, Eric casually closed the page. Maybe he was just overthinking it. Just as he was about to open the newspaper to see if there was any similar news in the recent movie reviews, Giselle and Alessandra, who had been pestering him for a while, sat up together. Alessandra tidied up her messy clothes and looked at Eric with some resentment. She said, "Eric, I didn't promise you anything." Eric opened a newspaper on the table and quickly browsed through the relevant information. He smiled and replied, "It's all fake anyway, just for show." "But Giselle doesn't look like it at all. She's just for show." Eric raised his head and looked at Alessandra. He said, "Then let's make the show real. I quite like it." Alessandra wanted to resist a little, but she couldn't muster up the courage. She suddenly remembered a very famous rumor in the circle. During the first Victoria's Secret fashion show, a Victoria's Secret angel named Heidi Klum was actually exiled to the southern hemisphere of New Zealand by Eric because she violated the rules by accepting an interview. Exiled, this kind of thing usually only happened a few hundred years ago. Later, Heidi Klum's career didn't improve at all. She could only mix between the second and third tier. Although the punishment was over, no big names were willing to work with her. Alessandra secretly cursed a certain person's arrogance and domineering. She looked at Giselle, who had just bullied her, and her eyes turned. She said to Eric, who was quickly browsing the newspaper, "Eric, aren't you afraid that Giselle will go back on her words in the future?" Eric raised his head and looked at Giselle. "Will you?" Giselle quickly shook her head, reached out, and pinched Alessandra's waist. Alessandra didn't dare to yell out. She only reached out to fight back, but Giselle grabbed her hand and pinched it again. Eric glanced at the movements of the two girls and smiled. The longer the entanglement between people, the deeper the entanglement, especially between men and women. When the time came, it wasn't something that could be broken with a word of regret. After roughly skimming through today's newspaper, Eric found a few more reviews that linked Level 1 Terror and 7 Deadly Sins together. There were many articles that, like the previous one, hinted that Edward Norton's acting was better than Kevin Spacey's. Publicity during the release of a movie was a common thing. Two movies stirred up the topic of each other and together, they could create a very good synergy and create a win-win situation. However, although the production cost of both movies was around $30 million US, before this, whether it was in terms of popularity or publicity, Level 1 Terror was much weaker than Seven Deadly Sins. Obviously, the producer of Level 1 Terror didn't have much hope for this movie. Otherwise, they wouldn't have only arranged more than 1,900 canvases for the movie's premiere, which was even less than Red Zone. Other than Edward Norton's performance, there wasn't anything special about the movie. Linking Level 1 Terror and Seven Deadly Sins to increase the popularity of the movie was probably the last move that Paramount could come up with. Eric thought about it for a while and casually wrote it down in a memo on his laptop. He didn't do anything else. The distribution of the movie was completely handled by the team of New Line. If Paramount was just trying to pull some strings, it would be good for everyone. If it was too much, New Line would naturally respond. Eric wasn't the kind of boss who would do everything himself. If he had to do everything himself, why would he spend money on a distribution team? The two girls played around like cats for a while. Giselle looked at Eric's desk full of documents and cleverly took the initiative to make coffee. Eric finished reading today's work email and happened to hear a notification for a new email. It was the response to the email he had just sent out. Eric opened it and looked up at Giselle, who was walking back with a coffee pot, and said, "Now, let's talk about you." Chapter 787. With Eric's detailed understanding of the world's economic trend in the next 20 years, it was easy to let Giselle get a huge amount of wealth. But if she simply had a huge amount of money, she would only be called a nouveau riche. Therefore, while having wealth, the most important thing was to get the power and influence that matched her personal net worth. In the original spacetime, the reason why Giselle got the title of Lady G was not only because her personal annual income was far more than other supermodels, but the key was that Giselle was the top of the new generation of supermodels and was the most sought after by the fashion industry. Giselle's annual income far exceeded that of the supermodels of her generation. In addition to her shrewd business mind, it was also the result of her personal influence. Eric didn't mean to completely change the trajectory of Giselle's life. He just wanted Giselle to go higher and farther on her original path, to get far more influence than in his previous life, and to become the real Queen Giselle in the fashion industry, not just the Lady G of the fans. Of course, looking at the young girl who was less than 16 years old, Eric knew that this game must take many years. However, Eric himself was only 26 years old this year. Time was not a problem for him and Giselle. Eric had reached the peak of his career that ordinary people couldn't reach. Occasionally, he cultivated a few legends that ordinary people talked about. It was also a kind of pastime. After all, what was the saying? Don't do boring things, there is a limit to the difficulty of life. Life is really lonely like snow. Giselle and Alessandra couldn't be aware of Eric's boring thoughts. Hearing that he wanted to talk about her, Giselle sat up straight. Even Alessandra was infected by this atmosphere and couldn't help but sit up straight. Eric also withdrew his thoughts and said to Giselle, "If you want to do more things, first of all, you have to wait until you are 18 years old and have complete independence. Otherwise, many things will be limited. However, these 2 years can give you time to further enrich yourself and get the recognition of the fashion industry. Well, at least get the title of supermodel first." Giselle nodded obediently, but Alessandra was secretly speechless. Supermodels. When they entered this industry, their goal was to become a supermodel, but Giselle could achieve all of this in just 2 years. In the fashion industry, if you wanted to be a supermodel, you must first have a naturally good figure. Appearance was not even the most important thing. Giselle had already met this condition. The next step was to get a contract with a modeling agency. The top management companies in the world had a very perfect model promotion mechanism and rich fashion resources. A girl who entered these companies might not necessarily become a supermodel, but if she couldn't enter these top management companies, the hope of becoming a supermodel would be even slimmer. Giselle's current agency, IMG, was not as popular as Elite, but it was still one of the top agencies in the industry. In this regard, IMG did not have any shortcomings that would hinder Giselle. Having a naturally good figure and a top modeling agency was only the beginning of a girl's journey to becoming a supermodel. The competition after that was really like crossing a single-plank bridge with thousands of soldiers and horses. After having an agency, the girls would have to participate in various modeling beauty contests, find ways to get on the pages of fashion magazines, win the favor of fashion moguls, and appear in famous brand shows. In the whole process, for all kinds of opportunities, pure body was the most insignificant price to pay. In the end, those who could really reach the top were absolutely 1 in 10,000. Of course, there were exceptions to everything. If you had a strong background, everything would immediately become much simpler. Therefore, the world was so capricious and so unfair that it was useless to bite anyone. Even the Empress Dowager Karl Lagerfeld, who wanted to kill all the fat people in the world, had to drag a mediocre and fat model to the Chanel press conference. After this weekend, you can go back to New York. You don't have to go to the performance training class anymore. Eric looked at the email, picked up a piece of paper next to him, and wrote down a string of numbers. He handed it to Giselle and said, "I just contacted Tina Brown. She happens to be in New York recently. After you go back, Tina will take you to see Anna Wintour, and then arrange for you to be on the cover of Vogue." In the entire Condé Nast system, Tina Brown's position was higher than Anna Wintour's. Anna Wintour's Vogue imitated Tina Brown's idea of running Vanity Fair. After Tina Brown left Vanity Fair and became the editor-in-chief of Yahoo, she still had connections and influence in Condé Nast. After all, as long as the senior management of Condé Nast were not stupid, they would not cut off their relationship with a strong woman who came from their own group and controlled a large new media platform. At the Vanity Fair party dinner just now, the reason why Eric allowed the crew of Forrest Gump to attend was also because Tina Brown had called to pull strings under the request of her old boss. It was not difficult to ask her to help him get on the cover of Vogue. The world's top fashion magazines might be cold and distant in front of ordinary people, but for Eric, it was nothing more than a small favor. The relationship between Firefly Group and Condé Nast was not as close as that of Hearst Group, but the cooperation between them had never been broken. After all, Firefly Group, which was a big advertiser, had always been the target of all newspaper companies. Eric did not have Anna Wintour's contact information. Otherwise, he could have called her directly. Anna Wintour would not have refused Eric's request. Eric said it lightly, but the two girls felt a wave in their hearts. Vogue was the world's Bible of fashion. If an ordinary model could get on the cover of Vogue once in his or her life, he or she would not have lived in vain. Alexander looked at Giselle with jealousy in his eyes. He even wanted to say to Eric, "Take my meat too." Giselle covered her chest excitedly. She asked unconfidently, "Eric, can I really be on the cover of Vogue? I'm not even 16 yet." Eric nodded. "Of course you can. I've never heard of a rule that says that you can't be on Vogue before you're 16. Eric had a clear idea. If he wanted to be on the cover of Vogue, he had to choose the best one. As long as Giselle could get on the cover of Vogue, she would immediately become famous in the fashion circle. She would get all kinds of invitations and media attention. It was much more effective than taking one step at a time. Giselle could not calm down so easily. She said nervously, "But..." "No buts." Eric interrupted Giselle and said, "Ask your agency to help with this matter. In addition, don't neglect your modeling training in the next few months. I can help you build a platform, but if you don't work hard enough, everything will be in vain." "Yes, I will." Giselle nodded quickly. Eric added, "Also, learn some French. At least you can communicate well. I'll arrange for you to attend the Paris Fashion Week in September." Of the 4 major fashion weeks, the Paris Fashion Week was the most stylish one. Prada, Dior, Versace, Givenchy, and other top luxury brands all held their product launches in the Paris Fashion Week. With the halo of these top brands, the Paris Fashion Week was the best stage for ordinary models to become supermodels. After Giselle nodded, Eric was about to say something when the phone on the table rang. Eric picked up his phone and glanced at it. It was an unfamiliar number. He picked it up and said, "This is Williams." The person on the other side of the phone said a few words. Eric smiled and said, "Hi, Anna, good morning. Has Tina told you about it? Sitting opposite him, Giselle and Alexander looked at each other, and a name appeared in their minds: Anna Wintour. Eric looked at Giselle, who was nervous again. He smiled and continued to talk to Anna Wintour. Her name is Giselle Bunchen. She's 16 years old, Eric said and gestured to Giselle. The girl immediately understood and stood up. Eric looked at her and said, "About 5 feet 10 inches, 178 centimeters. How about this? I can't explain it over the phone. I'll ask IMG to send you the details later." Eric frowned slightly and said, "August. It's a bit late in August. I hope she has 2 or 3 months to gain popularity before the Fashion Week in September. So it's best before July." What? Girl version? Anna, don't be perfunctory. Giselle had been listening to the conversation between the two of them. Seeing that Eric's tone was a little serious, she became nervous and wanted to smooth things over. A teenage version would be fine too. Of course, Giselle was just thinking about it. She didn't dare to interrupt their conversation. Under Eric's insistence, Anna Wintour agreed to arrange for Giselle to appear on the cover of Vogue in June. Eric didn't care about what to do with the girl on the cover. This result was not surprising at all. After all, compared to Eric's influence, the cover of a magazine was just a trivial matter. Anna Wintour would not hesitate to make a choice at all. Among the top 5 female fashion magazines, Vogue belonged to Condé Nast. The other 4 magazines, ELLE, Bazaar, Cosmopolitan and Marie Claire, were less influential than Vogue, but they all belonged to the Hearst Group. They were all ready to replace Vogue at any time. Thanks to the cooperation between ESPN and AETV Network, the Hearst Group and Firefly Group had a close relationship. It would be a major mistake on Anna Wintour's part if she pushed Eric and Firefly Group to the Hearst media camp because of something as trivial as a magazine cover. Of course, Anna Wintour knew that even if she rejected him, the possibility of Eric acting on impulse was very low. However, she wouldn't take the risk on such a small matter. After this matter was settled, the topic immediately became relaxed. With the intention of befriending Eric, Anna Wintour's words were also very friendly. She also promised to help contact the top fashion photographer, Stephen Messi, to personally shoot Giselle's cover. Eric hung up the phone. Giselle asked in a low voice, "Eric, were you talking about Stephen Messi?" Eric nodded. He had been in contact with the fashion circle for the past 2 years, so Eric had learned some information about top fashion photographers. Stephen Messi was the kind of fashion photographer who was very good at photographing women. The women under his lens always gave off a special sense of mystery and charm, like a group of black cats walking in the dark. Giselle got a definite answer. Excitement flashed across her face, but it quickly dimmed. She gestured with her small hands and mumbled, "Eric, inviting Stephen Messi to take photos should be very expensive. The company might not pay for it." "Don't worry. I'll have the bill sent to me," Eric said, and handed the phone to Giselle. "You don't have to contact Tina Brown when you go back to New York. Call your agent and ask him to send your information to the headquarters of Vogue." Giselle nodded and took the phone. She stood up and walked aside to make a call. Alexander, who had been watching everything, finally said, Eric tidied up the newspapers on the table and said casually, "You're still young. Wait for another 2 years." Alexander twirled his intertwined fingers and begged in a low voice, "I can be in the girls' edition of Vogue." "Don't be ridiculous. Anna will go crazy if you both get there at the same time." The box office on the first day was $3.6 million. On the weekend, Red District earned $4.16 million and $3.55 million respectively. The total box office was $11.31 million. While successfully topping the box office for the weekend, Red Flower District once again attracted a lot of media attention. While the new line was working hard to promote the film, they also began to release news that Jack Cheng would be working with the company on a new film. After the weekend, Giselle and Alexander returned to New York together. Eric was about to fly to the Bahamas to check out the shooting location of Casino Royale. However, before he left, Eric had to ask about the release of 7 Deadly Sins. Realizing that Paramount was trying to link Level 1 Terror with 7 Deadly Sins to hype up the topic, Eric wasn't going to intervene, and the distribution team of the new line quickly reacted. However, the direction of Paramount's media and public relations was very clear. They wanted to provoke the question of which of the two main villains, Kevin Spacey or Edward Norton, was better at acting so as to attract the fans' curiosity about Level 1 Terror. Paramount clearly knew that in terms of the overall quality of the movie, Level 1 Terror could not compare with the wonderful plot of 7 Deadly Sins. However, New Line Media's counterattack was focused on the overall quality of the film, which was exactly what Paramount wanted. Because of the early test screenings, Level 1 Terror was not as good as 7 Deadly Sins. This was a fact that was recognized by the film critics. New Line Media's public relations team repeatedly emphasized this point, but it did not make things worse. In any case, as long as they could make a connection between Level 1 Terror and 7 Deadly Sins and make fans compare the two films, Paramount's marketing would be a great success. Normally, when two films were talked about together, there would be a synergistic effect, which would increase the total box office. However, the situation was different this time. The Easter period in North America hadn't been developed yet, so the weekly number of viewers and the total box office wouldn't fluctuate too much during the Easter period. Before this, 7 Deadly Sins was already very popular due to the strong publicity of the new line. Therefore, even though 7 Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror were hyped up and had a synergistic effect, the total box office sales of the two movies would be higher than in the original Spacetime, but in the end, Level 1 Terror would be the only one to benefit. Due to Level 1 Terror taking a bigger share of the box office, the total box office of 7 Deadly Sins was likely to be lower than in his previous life. The box office of the original 7 Deadly Sins in North America had exceeded $100 million, which was obviously the result of New Line Entertainment's operation. That was because $100 million was an important milestone for most movies. If the box office exceeded $100 million, the film would enter the ranks of classic films. In this regard, even if a film's box office stopped at $99 million compared to $100 million, it would give off a completely different feeling. It was conceivable that if 7 Deadly Sins box office didn't exceed $100 million due to the influence of Level 1 Terror, it would only lose a few million USD. However, the film would receive a completely different treatment in the overseas market and the subsequent video releases. If the box office reached $80 or $90 million but didn't exceed $100 million, the fans would only think that the film was good, and it would be very difficult for them to feel like it was a classic. The original 7 Deadly Sins box office overseas was $220 million, and the video releases made New Line Entertainment even more profitable. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that 7 Deadly Sins box office hit $100 million in North America, which played a very big role. Therefore, if the box office of this version of 7 Deadly Sins didn't exceed $100 million, the final loss would definitely be more than just a few $100 million in the North American box office. Eric watched helplessly for a few days. Before leaving Los Angeles, he finally called Katzenberg. The two of them discussed in detail and decided on a marketing strategy to counter Level 1 Terror. Only then did he board the plane to the Bahamas with peace of mind. Chapter 788. After the intense auction 2 years ago, Paramount, which bought Disney's hand-drawn animation department for $2.5 billion, moved the entire team to a new office in Culver City, Los Angeles. At this time, Sherry Lansing, CEO of Paramount Pictures, walked out of the Paramount Animation Studio office building. She said goodbye to Roger Ailes and got into her car. When the car started, Sherry Lansing, who was leaning against the leather seat, gently rubbed her temples as she recalled the discussion she had with Roger Ailes about the release of Stranger in the Wind. Stranger in the Wind told the story of a Native American princess who rescued a British explorer and resolved a racial war. This was a project that Disney had been preparing for during the animation period. The detailed script, story version, and shots had already been decided during the animation period. After Paramount bought the hand-drawn animation team, the production of Stranger in the Wind began immediately. Although the salary of the entire animation team had increased significantly after the change of ownership. However, the resentment of being abandoned by Firefly did not dissipate so easily. Over the past year, the entire hand-drawn animation team had been working hard to create another masterpiece like The Lion King, so that Firefly would regret their decision to abandon the hand-drawn animation department. Therefore, although the usual 2-year animation period was shortened to 1.5 years, the quality of Stranger in the Wind was still very good. During the test screening, even Lei Shedong himself was full of praise for the animation. In order to realize Viacom's ambition to diversify the entire industry chain, Lei Shedong spared no effort in supporting Paramount's animation department. However, Sherry Lansing was far less optimistic than Lei Shedong and the animation team. Although the cost was strictly controlled, the production cost of Stranger in the Wind still reached $80 million because of the skyrocketing salary of the animators. Including the follow-up publicity, the total investment was likely to exceed $120 million, which was equivalent to twice the production cost of The Lion King. The two animations that were being produced, such as the sequel to The Lion King and Mulan, would definitely cost more. It would take at least 5 years to create a diversified industry chain that could fully exploit the commercial potential of animation with Paramount's animation as the engine of content and resources, combined with Viacom's blockbuster chain and Nickelback. Before that, if they wanted to recoup their investment in these expensive animation projects, they would have to rely on the movie box office. It was conceivable that in the long process of opening up the industry chain, as long as one of these huge investment animated films failed at the box office, it would seriously damage the capital chain of Paramount Pictures. They would even have to be like Warner Brothers, where not only could they not provide profits for the parent company, but they also had to obtain financial support from the headquarters. Also, Shirley Lansing had always been suspicious about why Firefly suddenly sold Disney's hand-drawn animation department. After all, that was when the global box office of The Lion King was close to $1 billion. Any rational business manager would not have made such an illogical decision. However, if the young man was being impulsive, this reason was even more untenable. Firefly had miraculously risen in less than 10 years and became the largest media group in North America and even the world. How could the person who built such a media empire be impulsive? However, if the sale of the hand-drawn animation department was the result of the other party's careful consideration, then Paramount was very likely to have taken on some very large and hidden risks. The decision to acquire Disney's hand-drawn animation department was made by Lei Shedong himself. Shirley Lansing knew that even if there were problems in the animation department, she would not bear too much responsibility. However, as the CEO of Paramount Pictures, if something like this happened, her life would definitely not be easy. Everything was a foregone conclusion. Shirley Lansing struggled for a while and quickly put this matter aside. She decided to focus more on live-action movies. Although there were not as many peripherals as animated films, live-action movies would always be the mainstream of Hollywood. "Is there any news from Steven?" Shirley Lansing sat up straight and asked the assistant in the front row. With the support of Microsoft, Spielberg would join forces with David Geffen and George Lucas to set up a new major studio. This was already known to the industry. Although everyone knew that this studio would gradually build their own distribution network, unless they continuously acquired the distribution channels of New Line and Disney like Firefly, at least in the next few years, Spielberg and the others would definitely have to hand over the distribution of their films to the 7 major studios. Because Bill Gates, the main investor behind the scenes, did not have a good relationship with Firefly, the 3 companies under Firefly would definitely not be considered by Spielberg. Sony Pictures was still in a mess, and Warner Brothers already had many affiliated production companies. Spielberg could only choose from Paramount and Universal, and these 2 companies were also trying their best to fight for this project. The assistant replied, "Mr. Spielberg's assistant called not long ago and said that Mr. Spielberg can spare some time tonight at 8 o'clock. I have already made a reservation at Morton Restaurant in Beverly Hills." Shirley Lansing nodded with satisfaction and looked at her watch. There was less than an hour left before the end of the day. She was about to instruct the driver to drive home so that she could prepare for dinner in advance when the fax machine in the front row of the car suddenly rang. 5 to 6 pages of information were printed before the fax machine stopped ringing. The assistant skimmed through the information and passed it to Shirley Lansing, who was sitting in the back row. It's about Level 1 terror. Over the past 2 days, there have been some reports on the media. Well, Miss Lansing, take a look at it yourself. Level 1 Terror was a crime thriller film directed by Gregory Hobright, who was the director and producer of L.A. Law Enforcement Network and New York Major Crimes Unit. The film cost $30 million and was considered a medium-cost production. Perhaps because Gregory Hobright was a TV director, he could not control the pace of the film well. The original film was more than 160 minutes long, and after many changes and edits, it was shortened to 130 minutes. Although it was still long, it could not be changed. Otherwise, it would affect the integrity of the entire story. After the initial internal test, other than the amazing performance of the newcomer, Edward Norton, the management did not think highly of the film. Therefore, the company did not pay much attention to the film's publicity. Until recently, the producer of Level 1 Terror, Gary Lucchesi, thought of a marketing plan to combine the film with Firefly's new film, 7 Deadly Sins, to increase the popularity of Level 1 Terror and promote the box office. Today was Wednesday, and both Level 1 Terror and 7 Deadly Sins would be released on Friday. Based on the feedback from various parties, Shirley Lansing was very satisfied with the results achieved by Gary Lucchesi's marketing plan. Seeing the assistant's hesitation after reading the fax, Shirley Lansing curiously took the few pages of the fax. The assistant had forgotten to arrange the pages of the fax. The first thing Shirley Lansing saw was some of the media's comments on Level 1 Terror. If 7 Deadly Sins only used some religious methods of torture to stimulate the senses, then the shocking reversal of the ending of Level 1 Terror brought us a pure shock to the soul. Countless theories and facts have proven that psychological fear is the real fear. In this regard, as a similar type of crime thriller, Level 1 Terror has undoubtedly achieved this point to the extreme. 7 Deadly Sins, on the other hand, is more like a cliched blood movie. Level 1 Terror is undoubtedly a highly completed crime thriller. There is no deliberately mystifying plot, and there are no stereotypical scenes to deliberately mislead the audience. There is only a shocking and frightening reversal of stimulation in the blink of an eye when people think that everything has been settled. If 7 Deadly Sins, which showcased its sadistic killing techniques, is worth 7 points, then Level 1 Terror is worth at least 5 points. Right now, I'm looking forward to going to the cinema to enjoy this truly wonderful film when it's officially released. After hurriedly skimming through a few paragraphs, Shirley Lansing frowned. The established publicity method was to provoke a comparison between the acting skills of the two villains, Edward Norton and Kevin Spacey. What was the situation now? 7 Deadly Sins had long been established in the circle. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to win the jury prize at the Sundance Film Festival. Now, they were promoting the quality of Level 1 Terror as being better than 7 Deadly Sins. Wasn't this waiting for the film to be slapped in the face after it was released? She looked up and said to her assistant, "Connect me to Gary's call." The assistant picked up the car phone and dialed as she turned back and said, "Ms. Lansing, this is from Mr. Lucchesi." Shirley Lansing nodded and flipped through the pages in her hand. She found Gary Lucchesi's remarks on the first page. It turned out that these comments were not the result of Paramount's marketing department. Other than Paramount, who else would pay attention to these two films? It went without saying. The call went through, and the assistant handed over the microphone. Shirley Lansing discussed with Gary Lucchesi, who was in charge of the publicity of Level 1 Terror, for a while. She helplessly put down the phone and read the few pages in her hand a few more times. Several ideas flashed through her mind, but she realized that none of them were suitable. These media comments were almost certain to come from Firefly Corporation. Shirley Lansing knew that even she would often make some counterattacks if she encountered such a situation. However, it was unlikely that she would use such a method that would make people feel helpless like Firefly Corporation. After all, these comments were praising Level 1 Terror in a positive way. Paramount could not publicly say that their film was not good enough and that it needed to be improved or something like that. However, if they did not do so, they could only allow the idea that Level 1 terror was better than 7 Deadly Sins to spread. Then, when the two films were released on a large scale, the media and the audience would realize that they had been deceived. By then, the outcome would be even more unpredictable. It was obvious that this was a form of flattery. They would raise you up high, and then you would fall and be smashed into pieces. The quality of Level 1 terror did not meet Paramount's expectations, so the publicity for the film was not very strong. However, this did not mean that Shirley Lansing did not care about this film. In the entire Paramount, there were definitely no more than 10 films that cost more than $30 million a year to produce. After thinking for a while, Shirley Lansing said, "Let's go back to the headquarters. Also, call Gary and the others to discuss countermeasures. What about the meeting with Mr. Spielberg? As long as we're not late. Pay attention to the time and remind me when the time comes." The publicity for a film usually started from the moment the film was approved. However, the real reputation of the film was established a few weeks before and after the official release. Before that, you could only try to let the audience know about such a film. It was not until the film started to have small-scale test screenings and was officially released on a large scale that word of mouth spread. After winning the jury award at the Sundance Film Festival in January, 7 Deadly Sins had a very strong presence among the media and film fans. Due to Paramount's ingenious joint promotion method, many people suddenly noticed a similar movie called Level 1 Terror as Easter approached. After all, there were not many ordinary people who would seriously study film criticism. They would only vaguely feel the influence of the general trend and gradually feel that perhaps Level 1 Terror was really better than 7 Deadly Sins, just as the newspaper said. A few days passed quickly. Easter was not a legal holiday in North America, but it was spring break for American college students. Most American college students would get at least a week of spring break during this period. Although some young people with good family backgrounds would choose to travel, most people did not have the financial ability to do so. However, watching a few movies with family and friends during the holidays was also a very common form of entertainment for Americans. 7 Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror were undoubtedly the first choices for most people to watch this Easter. On Friday, April 5th, the day before Easter, 7 Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror were released on 2,500 and 1,900 screens, respectively. Due to the lukewarm reception of Alien 3, David Fincher's popularity was not very high. However, the two male leads of 7 Deadly Sins, Matthew McConaughey and Morgan Freeman, were well-known Hollywood stars in recent years. Coupled with the gimmick of Victoria's Secret's angel and sexy goddess Diane Kruger's screen debut, it attracted a large number of people to buy tickets. At the same time, due to the influence of the media's comments on the two films in recent weeks, a large number of people chose Level 1 Terror. Chapter 789. Peter Rogier was an English teacher at Santa Monica High School. However, he also had another identity, which was a freelance film critic. Peter had been obsessed with movies since he was a child. When he was studying at the University of California, he tried to submit some film review articles to several newspapers. Fortunately, they were accepted and published. After graduation, he found out that this extra job allowed him to afford a nice house in the upscale community of Santa Monica, so he persevered. After more than 10 years, he became a little famous in the circle and published several film review collections. Sunday was Easter. Peter had planned to stay at home with his wife and children, but at the last minute, he received an invitation from the Hollywood Reporter to review Level 1 Terror. Level 1 Terror was an R-rated crime thriller, which was not suitable for the whole family to watch together. After dinner, Peter drove to downtown Santa Monica alone. After parking his car, he walked into the multiplex cinema that he often watched. It was almost 9 o'clock, which happened to be the time when the next screening was about to begin. Peter joined the crowd of people waiting in line to buy tickets. He remembered the recent media discussion about 7 Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror. Peter received an invitation from New Line Cinema for an internal screening. He had already seen 7 Deadly Sins 2 weeks ago. Although he did not like the film's theme of despair, he had to admit that David Fincher's interlocking storytelling was amazing. In the film review submitted to The Hollywood Reporter, Peter gave Seven Deadly Sins 8 out of 10. As for Level 1 Terror, it seemed that this film had only increased its publicity in recent weeks. It was even aggressively trying to compete with Seven Deadly Sins. After being in the circle for a long time, Peter certainly knew that there was something fishy going on. Although there were many reviews in the newspapers that Level 1 Terror overpowered Seven Deadly Sins, these were basically second-rate and third-rate newspapers with low credibility. Most mainstream newspapers would not be so rash as to pick a side. However, since Paramount dared to use the slogan Level 1 Terror to overpower Seven Deadly Sins, this film would not be bad. Peter still had some expectations in his heart. Just as he was slowly moving forward in the queue, there was a slight commotion in front of the ticket window. Peter looked over. It turned out that two pairs of young men and women had a disagreement on which movie to watch. Under the urging of the ticket seller, the four of them finally divided into two groups and chose Seven Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror respectively. Peter didn't care too much about this little episode. He was just a little envious of the young men and women's exuberant energy. The temperature of the April night in Los Angeles was still a little cold, but these young people were wearing thin clothes, and there were faint sunburn marks on their exposed skin. Peter judged that these people should be surfing at Santa Monica Beach during the day, because he liked this sport very much in college. However, looking down at his beer belly, perhaps he couldn't even climb up the surfboard now. Without dwelling on the lost youth, Peter got the movie ticket, bought a popcorn, and walked to the theater. After finding a seat and sitting down, Peter habitually looked around. About 40% of the seats were occupied. Peter was also surprised to find that the couple who had an argument with their companions were sitting one empty seat away from him. The girl noticed Peter looking over and nodded politely. Peter also nodded slightly and looked away, but heard the girl say to her boyfriend, "Zach, it's just a movie, we don't have to be separated from Vincent and the others." The young man named Zach said, "Michelle, I said during the day, I'm not interested in religious movies, and the newspaper seems to say that this movie is much better than Seven Deadly Sins, which was hyped up by publicity." Michelle seemed to curl her lips and said, "How do you know that this movie didn't get promoted by advertising? But its reputation should be better than Seven Deadly Sins." "It seems that there's a very outstanding actor," Zach said as he hugged his girlfriend again. Lowering his voice slightly, he teased, "It's not bad that we're not with them. At least no one will disturb us." Michelle pushed Zach away and scolded with a smile, "Go away, you're so annoying." Peter listened to these conversations and felt a little uncomfortable. He was considering whether to change seats, but the lights in the theater dimmed, and the couple also quieted down, so Peter dismissed the idea. After a few patches of advertisements, the opening of Paramount Pictures appeared. The movie began with a discussion about whether lawyers should adhere to the law or pursue justice. Martin Weir, a lawyer played by Richard Gere, insisted that lawyers should try their best to win for their clients in court, regardless of whether the other party was really guilty or not. If this was a movie below the PG-13 level, according to Jingji's correct thinking, this dialogue was likely to imply that the movie was about Martin Weir's transformation from a mercenary and indifferent lawyer to a guardian of justice. Of course, since this was an R-rated crime thriller, the theme was difficult to predict. The story was set in Chicago, a bishop was brutally murdered, and a suspect named Alan Stan Puller was quickly arrested. Because of some emotional entanglements with the prosecution's lawyer, Janet Venable, Martin Weir decided to be Alan's lawyer. In his communication with Alan, Martin Weir gradually realized that the other party might be a mental patient with multiple personality disorder, so he applied to the court for a psychiatric evaluation of Alan. At this point, Peter, who was sitting in the theater, looked at his watch and found that 45 minutes had passed. In these 45 minutes, except for the important plot twist that Alan might be a mental patient, the movie did not give much useful information. In fact, in Peter's opinion, many details were redundant. The director seemed to be foreshadowing something, but he could not figure out what it was. However, there was no doubt that these lengthy foreshadowing would only gradually make the audience lose interest in watching the movie. Because he was a little disappointed with the movie, Peter began to unconsciously become distracted. The couple nearby had been very quiet, which surprised him a little, so he looked over and found that the girl named Michelle had fallen asleep on the boy's shoulder. Peter smiled. For most people, the slow pace of the movie would indeed make people sleepy. The movie's plot continued. Although many signs on Alan's body proved the possibility that he was mentally ill, the doctor, Molly, did not find any conclusive evidence. Instead, Martin accidentally found a videotape of the bishop forcing Alan and his girlfriend to have sex in front of him. This videotape immediately became the key evidence of Alan's motive for killing the bishop. Martin angrily asked Alan why he hid this from him, and accidentally triggered the other personality in Alan's body, Troy. Peter, who had already lost interest in the movie, finally perked up when he saw the submissive and even stuttering Alan on the screen suddenly become a violent villain. There was also a commotion in the theater, and some people exclaimed softly. Unfortunately, the process of Alan's multiple personality disorder was not filmed. In order to prove his judgment, Martin used some means to stimulate the other side of Alan face to face at the trial. In the end, the court ruled Alan's illness, cancelled the charges against Alan, and sent him to a mental hospital. When this matter seemed to be coming to an end, the movie's plot turned again. In the last meeting between Martin and Alan, he accidentally noticed the flaw in Alan's words and found that Alan did not have multiple personality disorder. All of this was just the result of Alan's subtle disguise. In the end, Martin walked out of the prison in a daze. The bleak and desolate scene in the square seemed to be a great mockery of Martin's own argument at the beginning of the movie. The subtitles rose, and the audience in the theater began to get up and leave. Peter could faintly hear some people's comments. "It's so boring. I actually wasted more than 2 hours for such a movie. If I had known, I would have watched 7 Deadly Sins. At least Diane Kruger is pleasing to the eye in that movie." Didn't the newspaper say that this movie is better than 7 Deadly Sins? If both movies are at this level, I'd rather stay at home and watch TV this Easter. That guy named Edward Norton's performance is indeed very good, but it's not as good as the media touted it. I almost fell asleep. Peter waited for a while and stood up. The couple on his left also got up and walked out. He could see the girl leaning on her boyfriend sleepily and rubbing her eyes. Following the crowd out of the theater and leaving the theater, Peter was surprised to find that the 4 people he met at the beginning were walking in front of him. They seemed to be going to a parking space not far away. This movie is so exciting. Kevin Spacey used himself to complete the last 2 punishments of the original sin. Also, Diane Kruger is so King beautiful. She was killed recently. It's a pity that there's no close-up of her head. A tall and thin young man was excitedly describing his feelings after watching 7 Deadly Sins. The girl holding his arm smiled and interrupted, "Hey Vincent, your tone when you say this is really too weird." "Okay, baby." Vincent changed the topic and asked his companion, "How was Level 1 terror?" Zach didn't answer, but his girlfriend Michelle didn't hide it. She smiled and said, "It was very boring. Anyway, I fell asleep. What do you think, Zach?" Zach hesitated and said, "At least that guy named Edward Norton's acting is very good." Hee hee. Michelle consciously thought that Zach's words were stubborn. She said to her companion, "Let's watch 7 Deadly Sins again tomorrow." Vincent waved his arm and said, "Of course, you should really go watch Level 1 Terror." To hell with it. It was already past 11 o'clock. Peter accidentally eavesdropped on the conversation of the young men and quickly got into his car. Driving on the slightly empty street in the middle of the night, Peter began to think about the film review of Level 1 Terror. He felt that he could only give the film 5 points at most, 0. 5 of which was the bonus of Edward Norton's performance. However, although Edward Norton's performance was amazing, it was not enough to make up for the overall mediocrity of the film. The director deliberately added a lot of unnecessary details in the early stages of the film in order to pursue an unexpected ending like Henry Henry. Although there were a lot of comments on the media these days about the reversal of the film's ending, in Peter's opinion, this deliberate reversal was the film's biggest flaw. If the film had given up on this reversal from the beginning, then the director could have told a more compact thriller based on Aaron's multiple personality disorder, instead of using a lot of space to pave the way for the final reversal of the ending. Due to these redundant foreshadowing, there was only one plot conflict in the movie that could cheer people up after 70 minutes into the movie. However, 70 minutes was enough to make 90% of the people lose their patience with the movie. This could be seen from the way the girl named Michelle fell asleep in the theater. Thinking about the review article, Peter also felt that the media's manipulation of Level 1 terror was a little too obvious. Peter even had a premonition that Paramount might have shot himself in the foot this time. During the Easter period, only 7 Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror could attract people's attention in the entire Hollywood film market. Due to the recent media influence, the two films were very popular. However, after the film was released on a large scale, many people realized that Level 1 Terror was far from being as good as the media's comments. At least, it was far from being comparable to 7 Deadly Sins, which had a tight plot and interlocking plot. The greater the expectation, the greater the disappointment. The internet had not yet become widespread, so it was difficult for ordinary people to express their opinions. However, after the film was released on a large scale, the media's comments could no longer be controlled. It's a failure with a long plot. Although Edward Norton's performance is wonderful, it can't change the overall mediocrity of the film. Compared to the tight plot of 7 Deadly Sins, I don't see what's so good about this film. The director is addicted to creating an unexpected ending like Henry's, but he has neglected whether the audience has enough patience to wait for 2 hours for an ending that won't bring them many surprises. It's hard to imagine that some people would compare this mediocre film with 7 Deadly Sins. 7 Deadly Sins is undoubtedly the best thriller in recent years since The Silence of the Lambs. Level 1 Terror, on the other hand, does not bring any surprises to the audience except for Edward Norton's remarkable performance. At the same time as the media's comments exploded, Firefly stopped all of their little tricks to manipulate the reputation of Level 1 Terror. Without the support of a large number of positive reviews, the reputation of Level 1 Terror, which had been faintly suppressing 7 Deadly Sins, quickly fell off a cliff. Even some of the media, who were originally optimistic about Edward Norton's performance, had a backlash due to the hype of Level 1 Terror before the film was released, and their comments on the film became even more harsh. The two films were released on April 5th at the same time. In the first 3 days, 7 Deadly Sins easily won the box office title for the week with a box office of $13.9 million. Although Level 1 Terror's reputation fell quickly, it still managed to achieve a box office of $11.2 million in its first weekend due to the fact that it was on par with 7 Deadly Sins. After that, the box office of 7 Deadly Sins reached a total of $18.4 million. Although the reputation of Level 1 Terror began to collapse, the box office of Level 1 Terror still reached $15.5 million in its first week. Compared to the difference of 600 screens between the two films, the average attendance of Level 1 Terror was not much worse than that of 7 Deadly Sins. Paramount was originally worried that the collapse of the reputation of Level 1 Terror would affect the box office of Level 1 Terror. However, after seeing the box office figures of $11.2 million in its first weekend and $15.5 million in its first week, they were immediately relieved. At the very least, the hype in the early stages played a very important role. Paramount originally estimated that the box office of the film would only be around $12 million in its first week. Most filmmakers understood that the scale of a film's marketing determined the starting point of its box office, but the reputation of a film determined the length of its box office curve. Although the box office of Level 1 Terror was not much worse than that of 7 Deadly Sins due to the joint promotion of Level 1 Terror and 7 Deadly Sins, as the reputation of the two films began to diverge rapidly, the subsequent box office curves of the two films began to diverge. Relying on the strong reputation of the film, 7 Deadly Sins' box office only dropped by a very weak 9.7% in its second week, reaching $16.6 million. The collapse of Level 1 Terror caused the box office of the same genre to drop by 46% in its second week. Compared to the $16.6 million box office of Seven Deadly Sins, Level 1 Terror only earned $37 million, which was only half of Seven Deadly Sins. In the third week, Seven Deadly Sins' box office drop was still only a miraculous 15%, reaching $11 million. At this time, the weekly box office of Level 1 Terror had been left far behind. The reverse psychology of the fans' expectations turned into disappointment, causing the movie's attendance to drop significantly once again. It only earned $77 million in its third week, which was almost a fraction of what Seven Deadly Sins had earned. Edward Norton's wonderful performance was also affected by the contrast of the film's reputation. In May, the box office of Seven Deadly Sins remained in the tens of millions, reaching $32 million in its fourth week. Although the drop in the box office of Level 1 Terror had begun to decrease, the $19 million weekly box office also indicated that the film was on the verge of dropping out of the picture. After 4 weeks of screening, Seven Deadly Sins accumulated a total of $43 million, while Level 1 Terror only earned $83 million, barely breaking the budget. Based on the current box office curve, Seven Deadly Sins was destined to last until the hot summer. It would not be difficult for the box office to break the 100 million mark, but Level 1 Terror could only stay in theaters for 2 weeks at most. At this point, there was no longer any doubt as to who was better between the two films. It was worth mentioning that while Seven Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror were going against each other, Red Zone quietly stayed in theaters in North America for 6 weeks. In the end, it accumulated a total of $43 million, but unfortunately, it was not close to $50 million. However, the box office data was very satisfactory to the company. New Line had only invested $10 million in the film, so the company would earn more than 100% of the profits from the box office alone. Red Zone also received good reviews from the media, and Jack Cheng even received the title of the cutest action actor. Then, New Line also applied for a nomination for Jack Cheng for Best Fighting Scene at the upcoming MTV Movie Awards in June. However, due to the conflict between Seven Deadly Sins and Level 1 Terror during the screening process, Jack Cheng's chances of winning this award were close to zero. After all, MTV was a media company owned by Viacom, and both parties had just fought. How could they give you the award? What fairness? Stop messing around. Chapter 790. Casino Royale was shot in the UK, Italy, the Czech Republic, and the Bahamas. There were more than 60 detailed locations, which was where the James Bond series had always spent a lot of money. Eric left in early April and surveyed all the filming locations. It was May 6th when he returned to Los Angeles. It was Monday, which happened to be the 5th week of the release of Seven Deadly Sins. Seven Deadly Sins accumulated a box office of $43 million in 4 weeks, and earned $12 million in 3 days at the end of the 5th week. Compared to the previous week, the drop was only 17%. Then came the summer break. Although the production of Seven Deadly Sins would be squeezed, the high popularity of the film would definitely rebound. There was no doubt that the total box office would exceed $100 million. As for Level 1 Terror, with its box office of $63 million in 3 days at the end of the 5th week, it would probably be completely removed from North America after next week. Level 1 Terror was not a film that Paramount was focusing on, and neither of the two films was a popular genre. That was why Firefly won so easily this time. In the following summer blockbusters, it would not be so easy for a company to manipulate the public's reputation. They could only do the publicity work that they could and then sit down and wait for the market's reaction. In fact, at this time, even reputation was not the most important thing. Some movies had terrible reviews from film critics, but it could not stop the audience from buying tickets enthusiastically to enter the movie. Titanic was still in post-production and was expected to be completed by the end of July. Firefly only had 2 major films in the summer break this year, The Matrix, which was released on May 31st, and Fatal Island, which was released on June 14th. Due to the absence of Titanic, New Line inserted the already completed Final Destination into the original schedule of Titanic, which was scheduled to be released on June 28th. Casino Royale was scheduled to officially start shooting on June 2nd. However, Eric could not be on set on that day. To accommodate his schedule, the premiere of The Matrix was moved forward to May 27th. As for the premiere of Fatal Island, Eric could only regretfully miss it. After returning to Los Angeles, Eric didn't even have time to rest due to the jet lag. He had to once again immerse himself in the construction of the FFM toll booth. After a few months of work, in addition to the original cable station in Telcom's hands, the 3 companies had acquired a few smaller cable stations from Cablevision and other operators. In total, they had about 4 million users. Eric originally wanted to take over Showtime from Viacom. In his previous life, this fee-paying cable TV station was second only to HBO in terms of scale and popularity. Now, the subscriber scale was only about 500,000. Because it was still very small, this TV station was considered a dispensable business in Viacom's system. However, after Katzenberg called to express his interest in the acquisition, Sam Lei Sherdong did not hesitate to refuse. Eric estimated that Lei Sherdong would definitely study why Firefly was interested in Showtime in private. However, this kind of behavior was destined to be useless. The only thing that Eric was interested in at this time was the hundreds of thousands of users of Showtime. Since Lei Sherdong refused to sell Showtime, Eric focused on the other TV stations that he had already acquired. According to the original trajectory of history, other than HBO, the other major media companies missed out on the opportunity of premium streaming platforms. Later, when Showtime, Starz, and other premium streaming platforms caught up, the era of online streaming had already arrived. At that time, in order to compete with Time Warner's old cable station business and the new online streaming business, Fox, Disney, and Comcast cooperated to set up an online streaming platform called Hulu. However, the 3 companies had always had differences in the development of Hulu. None of them had absolute control of the platform, so in the end, they parted on bad terms. Even the management left to look for other ways to compete with HBO, Netflix, and other platforms. Hulu's cooperation method was very similar to that of FFM. In the preliminary plan, FFM's equity distribution was 30% for Firefly, 30% for News Corporation, 20% for MGM, and 20% for MGM. The remaining 20% was held by Telcom, Cablevision, and other cable operators. Although Firefly and MGM cooperated, 50% of the shares was enough for Eric to completely control the company. However, if they wanted to cooperate for a longer time, they had to agree on the development trajectory, profit model, and other aspects of the TV station. In terms of the development of FFM, the 2 main decision-makers, Eric and Murdoch, did not have many differences. MGM was naturally on Eric's side, and the other major media companies also promised not to participate in the company's operations. Therefore, as long as Eric and Murdoch reached an agreement, everything would go smoothly. In order to prevent the management of the 3 companies from affecting the development of FFM, Eric and Murdoch decided to set up a new cable company that would be responsible for FFM's operations. The company's management would report directly to Eric and Murdoch, and would not be restricted by the management of the 3 major media companies. With the support of Firefly, News Corporation, and MGM's content, FFM's development would not be restricted by the content. The main problem with FFM was that it did not have a strong foundation. It did not have a brand like HBO, which had been operating for more than 20 years. Therefore, in order to develop FFM as quickly as possible, a manager who knew how to build a reputation was necessary. Eric immediately thought of a certain fat man. Beverly Hills. It was the same open-air restaurant that Eric had been to a few times. It was afternoon. Eric and Murdoch sat alone on the terrace and talked about FFM. Murdoch lived in New York most of the time, and occasionally went to London. This time, he came to Los Angeles specifically for FFM. HBO has been developing for 23 years since 1973, and it has a very solid reputation among the audience. If FFM wants to develop in this new market, the most important thing is to build a brand. We have to make the audience recognize FFM's brand in the shortest time possible. In this regard, although we have more film resources than Time Warner, the audience doesn't know about this. The power of habit is very strong, so we have to find another way. When Eric said this, Murdoch, who was sitting next to him, said, "Are you talking about reality shows like America's Top Model and Project Runway?" Lifetime TV had become famous because of these two reality shows, and they had become a classic example of the industry. Eric shook his head and said, "No, although everyone knows that reality shows aren't that real, they still have the word real in them. If a reality show on cable TV wants to attract the audience's attention, the scale will definitely be much higher than cable TV and public TV. If we don't pay attention, we will violate social ethics and even the law. This is a minefield, and we definitely shouldn't touch it." Then, it's a self-produced drama like Desire City. Murdoch immediately understood and shook his head slightly. However, a TV drama can never be as well made as a movie. It's fine if it's a basic cable channel, but it's not that easy to get the audience to spend more money to watch a premium TV drama. Then we'll use the standards of a movie to make a TV drama. In fact, Firefly originally had such a project. It was an idea I had after Saving Private Ryan. I originally planned to invest about $100 million to make a large-scale miniseries about World War II. Unfortunately, this project wasn't suitable for ABC, so it was delayed. Murdoch gently rubbed the coffee cup in his hand, leaned back in his chair, and asked, $100 million. Do you think we can recoup the cost? If this project is put on ABC, we definitely won't be able to recoup the cost. It's absolutely impossible for advertisers to pay more than other TV shows. After it's broadcast on public TV, syndication and videotape income will also be greatly reduced. However, this might not be the case after it's broadcast on cable TV. First of all, we can get a subscription income. Second, as long as these miniseries can become famous enough, we can recoup the cost and make a profit from the subsequent distribution of videotapes and syndication. Murdoch had a look of understanding and said, "I understand. That's why you want Wayne Stan to run this TV station, right?" Eric smiled and nodded. For a self-produced drama to become famous, other than the necessary word of mouth, the other methods were similar to how a film produced by an independent film company wanted to get a high box office. They all needed to be similar to how a film produced by an independent film company wanted to get a high box office. They all needed similar marketing operations. In the past, the biggest gimmick to show the excellence of HBO's works was the hundreds of Emmy nominations that were often mentioned by the media. As long as there were enough outstanding works, there was no one who could surpass the Wayne Stan brothers in terms of operating awards. This year, Forrest Gump swept all the Oscars, and Mira Mike still took the two heavyweight acting awards of Best Actress and Best Supporting Actor. When Eric was still in Europe, he talked to Harvey Stan on the phone several times. Wayne Stan was also very interested in taking over FFM TV station, so today's meeting was held. Eric looked at his watch. It was almost time, so he waved to the waiter and asked him to bring a new pot of coffee. Murdoch was waiting for the waiter to leave. Suddenly, he changed his tone to that of an elder and said, "Eric, you're going to be 26 soon, right?" Eric's heart skipped a beat. Why did this line sound so familiar? What was going to happen next? Eric was thinking about how to interrupt when a chubby figure appeared in time to avoid the awkward situation. Eric had always been a bachelor. In his previous life, his parents were forced to get married every festive season. Due to the influence of traditional Eastern values, he chose to get married at the age of 30. In this life, Eric didn't want to be tied down again, not to mention that his current situation was a bit complicated. It was not suitable for him to get married at all. "Good afternoon, Rupert, Eric, I hope I'm not late." Wayne Stan walked in front of the two and warmly hugged them. "Of course not, we're just a little early." Eric happily let go of Wayne Stan. He thought to himself, "You came just in time." Murdoch looked helpless. Although he could be as cunning as a fox in the business world, in front of his children, Murdoch could not be like Lei Sherdong, who did not recognize his family. Instead, he was like those traditional parents who doted on their children, hoping that their children could grow up and start a family. Unfortunately, each of his children was more troublesome than the other. Not to mention the second daughter and the eldest son, the youngest son, James, was racing with someone some time ago and happened to be caught by the police. Fortunately, there was no accident. Wayne Stan felt that Murdoch's expression was a little strange. He took the initiative to get up and take the coffee pot from the waiter. He poured for the three of them and gave Eric a puzzled look. Eric could only ignore him. There was no way to explain it at all. Fortunately, Murdoch didn't stay depressed for too long. He took the initiative and said, "Harvey, about that matter, what do you think?" Wayne Stan quickly said, "Of course I want to take over FFM, but I still have some questions." "What is it?" Wayne Stan organized his thoughts and said, "If I'm in charge of FFM, will I only need you, Eric, and MGM?" Murdoch looked at Eric. Eric replied, "Of course, FFM is completely independent. The management of the three companies have no jurisdiction over you. However, I still hope that you can cooperate with them." Wayne Stan was relieved when he heard Eric's promise. Mira Mike had developed well in the past 2 years, but it was still a subsidiary of 20th Century Fox. It was 2 levels below the parent company, News Corporation. Weinstein also hoped to gain a bigger platform and power in the media industry. With the importance that the 3 companies attached to FFM TV, he was sensitive enough to realize that this was a very good opportunity. Also, about the salary. Speaking of this, Weinstein rubbed his hands with an honest expression, as if he was a little embarrassed. Eric wasn't fooled by Wayne Stan's expression. He told Wayne Stan the plan that he discussed with Murdoch and said, "Rupert and I hope that you can sign a 5-year contract with an annual salary of $250,000 and 1 million stock options per year." Due to Mira Mike's outstanding performance, Wayne Stan received more than $10 million in bonuses and dividends every year. However, he didn't think that $250,000 was too little. Even Katzenberg's annual salary was only $750,000. In Hollywood, people only cared about bonuses and dividends. As long as the company's performance was good, a Hollywood executive's annual salary could range from a few million to tens of millions. Wayne Stan also knew that the focus of this salary was the 1 million stock options, so he asked, "Eric, how much is FFM's total share capital?" Eric thought for a bit and said, "After the company is integrated, it will have about 400 million shares." The so-called stock options were set by shareholders to the management at a lower price. The management could choose whether to buy the company's shares at that price within a certain period of time. If the company's performance and market value didn't increase, or even fell, the management wouldn't be willing to buy out the options at a high price. But if the company's share price doubled or even higher, the management could buy the shares at half price. This was actually a reward mechanism. Wayne Stan had read some materials before. FFM's current market value was about $1 billion. The 5 million stock options were equivalent to 1.25% of the total share capital. It would only cost about $10 million to buy out all of them, which he could afford. However, even if FFM's market value doubled in 5 years, he would only get about $10 million from the options. This was far less than what he expected. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.